What happens when you're the one human girl caught between two dangerously hot alphas on the same ice hockey team? One is your fated mate. One is your deepest craving. Both are off limits, and both want to mark you. In this spicy werewolf love triangle, destiny collides with forbidden desire on and off the ice. And tonight, you don't choose one. This is Ice Hockey and Forbidden Mates, torn between two alphas. Make sure you watch until the end, because the final scene is the hottest one yet. Plus, I've got 4 exclusive bonus spicy stories waiting for you after the main episode by the end. Ready? Let's play. Lyra Wren adjusted the strap of her backpack as she stepped into the chilled air of Hawthorne University's ice arena. The scent of freshly resurfaced ice and faint hints of sweat hit her at once. It was her first day as the new medical assistant for the Hawthorne Ice Wolves, the elite ice hockey team that just so happened to be made up entirely of werewolves. The Wolves weren't just any team. They were the pride of the university, backed by the Wildclaw Pack and composed mostly of high-ranking shifters. Their speed, strength, and aggression on the ice were legendary. Most humans kept their distance, and Lyra had fully intended to do the same, until she landed this medical assistant job shortly after starting her freshman year at Hawthorne University. She didn't mind. She was here to learn, to work, and to keep her scholarship. Not to get involved with wolf politics. And definitely not to get involved with any wolves, period. Her current boyfriend, Theo, was human. Stable, sweet, and utterly uninterested in dominance games or moon cycles. Just the way she liked it. Still, as Lyra stood nervously at the edge of the rink, clipboard in hand, she couldn't help but feel out of place. She was just the daughter of a nurse and a mechanic. She didn't come from a pack. She didn't have fangs, claws, or a bloodline that meant anything. She was just Lyra. "Hey, you the new med tech?" a voice called out. She turned to see a tall guy in full hockey gear skating toward her. His helmet was off, revealing tousled brown hair and sharp amber eyes. He offered a friendly smile. "Yeah, I'm Lyra," she said, holding out her hand. "Ellie. Defenseman. Ronan's the captain, he's..." "Late," someone growled from behind. Lyra turned and froze. The man who strode onto the ice was at least 6'4", broad-shouldered, and radiating the kind of cold authority that made the air feel even colder. His eyes were a piercing storm gray, his dark hair damp from the locker room, curling slightly at the ends. Tattoos snaked down his arms, visible beneath the pushed-up sleeves of his hoodie. Ronan Thorne. The alpha heir of the Wildclaw Pack. The Ice King of Hawthorne. She'd seen his face on campus banners, in sports columns, and whispered about in dorm hallways. But none of that prepared her for the real thing. He didn't look at her. Not really. His gaze skimmed over her like she was part of the wall. "This the new handler?" he asked Eli. "Medical assistant," Lyra corrected, trying to sound calm. That got her a glance. Brief. Sharp. His nostrils flared the slightest bit, and his jaw tightened. "Try not to get in the way," he muttered before skating off to join the rest of the team. Lyra exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. What the hell was that? "Don't take it personally," Eli said with a wince. "That's just Ronan. He's complicated." "Rude, you mean?" Eli chuckled. "That too. But he's the best. You'll see." She watched Ronan cut through the ice with brutal precision, his movements efficient and lethal, like a predator stalking prey. Even when he wasn't looking at her, she felt his presence in her bones. And despite every warning bell in her head, Lyra couldn't look away. The rest of practice passed in a blur. Lyra took notes on player injuries, iced a sprained wrist, and tried not to stare at Ronan every time he skated past. But it was impossible not to notice him, how he moved like he owned the rink, how his teammates instinctively gave him space, how the entire energy of the arena shifted when he spoke. She didn't understand why he unsettled her so much. It wasn't just the tattoos or the scowl or the sheer size of him. It was something else. Something primal that made the hairs on the back of her neck rise every time he got close. After practice, she waited outside the locker room to return the med kit. Players streamed past her, laughing, shoving each other, dripping sweat and testosterone. Ronan was the last to emerge, hoodie up, earbuds in. He didn't see her at first. Then his eyes locked on hers. She froze. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway emptied. Time slowed. Then he walked past her without a word. Lyra exhaled shakily, clutching the med kit tighter. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears. That look, whatever it was, had pierced straight through her. Like he recognized something in her he wasn't supposed to. Later that night, at the freshman welcome fair, Lyra wandered through a maze of booths and fairy lights strung between trees. Music thumped from portable speakers, and the scent of food trucks lingered in the air. She wasn't looking for anyone. But she saw him. Ronan. Leaning against a tree, hoodie up, hands buried in his pockets. Talking to no one. Watching everything. This time, when their eyes met, he didn't look away. He stared. With hunger. And something inside Lyra, a part of her she didn't know existed, stirred. She walked away quickly, pulse racing. Told herself she was imagining it. That it meant nothing. He didn't even like humans. He didn't even speak to her. But her body remembered the look in his eyes. And it thrilled her. That night, Lyra lay in bed, wide awake. Her boyfriend Theo had texted her something sweet. But when she closed her eyes, it wasn't Theo's face she saw. It was Ronan's. And the way he looked at her, like she was already his prey. A few days passed. Lyra tried to forget the way Ronan had looked at her at the welcome fair, that sharp, feral hunger buried under storm-gray eyes. But the memory clung to her like static, showing up in the quiet moments, pulsing behind her eyes when she tried to sleep. She couldn't explain it. Couldn't shake it. Then her birthday arrived. Should have been a good day. Balloons, cake, a sweet message from Theo. Instead, it started with a lie. Theo had sent her a text that morning. "Happy birthday, babe! Sorry, can't make it tonight. Study group." Hours later, she received a photo. Blurry. Snapchatted. Him, shirtless, on someone else's bed. Not alone. One of her classmates had sent it to her by accident. A blurry Snapchat of Theo shirtless in someone else's dorm room. Not alone. Lyra had stared at the image until her eyes burned, until the room tilted slightly. Then she'd closed the app, locked her phone, and thrown it across the bed. "Come on," Lily coaxed from the doorway, already half-dressed in party sequins and eyeliner sharp enough to kill. "You can't stay here sulking on your birthday. Let's get wasted." "I don't feel like it." "That's exactly why you need to come. Booze, music, distraction. Repeat after me. We do not spiral over boys who cheat with econ majors and fuzzy socks." Lyra let out a bitter laugh. "You saw the socks too?" Lily just grinned and tossed her a shot-sized bottle of vodka. "Pre-game. I'll be waiting." Party was loud, cramped, and reeked of sweat and spiked punch. Someone had hung cheap string lights and there was glitter in the air, on the floor, on people's skin. Lyra wore black jeans and a tight burgundy tank top she normally wouldn't dare to wear in public. Her braids were half up, lip gloss gleaming. She looked good. She felt numb. The drinks helped. One turned into 3. Someone handed her a glitter shot. She didn't taste it. Just downed it. She danced with Lily. Laughed too loudly. Pretended she didn't check the door every time it creaked open. Theo didn't show. Not that she expected him to. She was done. Over it. So over it. She needed air. Corridor was dim, cooler, quieter. Her head spun slightly as she leaned against the wall, fingers fumbling with her phone. She didn't want to call anyone. Didn't want to go back inside either. She wandered. One hallway led to another, until she pushed open a heavy door and was met with a sudden blast of cold. The ice rink. Dark mostly. But not empty. Someone was on the ice. Ronan. Alone, shirtless under an open hoodie, gliding like a shadow across the rink. His blades cut deep and sharp, echoing through the cavernous arena. Lyra stood frozen at the edge, breath catching in her throat. He didn't notice her at first. Or maybe he did. Maybe he always knew when someone was watching. Because the second she shifted her weight, the second her foot squeaked against the floor, he stopped. Turned. Their eyes locked across the empty rink. Lyra felt her heartbeat stutter. Her limbs tingled with a buzz that had nothing to do with alcohol. She took a step back. And tripped. Her heel caught on the rubber mat. She pitched forward with a startled yelp. And before she hit the ground, strong arms caught her. Warm. Solid. Scented with ice and heat and something wild. Ronan. He pulled her close, one arm around her back, the other steadying her by the waist. "Careful," he murmured, voice low, gravelly. She blinked up at him, dazed. Sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't know you were." His face was close. Too close. His nose brushed her neck. He inhaled. And for a moment, everything in him froze. Then, a low growl rumbled in his chest. His grip tightened just slightly. His lips parted, hovering near the curve of her throat. Lyra's breath caught. Her skin burned where he touched her. Every nerve screamed. But then his tongue flicked against her skin just once. Soft. Hot. Possessive. Lyra gasped. He said nothing. Did nothing else. Just breathed her in like she was air and he was starving. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "What are you?" She shivered. "What?" His gaze burned into hers. Wild. Conflicted. Almost afraid. "I can't," he began, but the words choked off. He let her go. Just like that. Turned, skated away, vanishing into the shadows of the rink. Lyra stood there, heart racing, throat tingling, legs unsteady. She should have run. But instead, she touched the spot where his mouth had been. The other day in the morning, Lyra woke up tangled in her sheets, breathless and flushed. Her skin burned. Sweat slicked her back. The room wasn't hot, but her body was on fire. Her thighs ached. Her lips were swollen. Her core throbbed with an ache that didn't make sense. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself, blinking up at the ceiling like it might explain what had just happened. It was a dream. A stupid dream. But gods, it had felt real. Ronan had touched her. Not just touched, claimed. Pressed her against the locker room wall, his breath hot against her throat, hands splayed over her hips. His voice had been low, demanding. His teeth grazing her skin. And the way she had begged for it. For him. She groaned and covered her face with her hands. What the hell was happening to her? She wasn't like this. She wasn't obsessed. Except she was. Her body remembered his scent. His touch. That flick of his tongue on her neck. It was burned into her. Like a brand. She barely managed to drag herself into the shower. Even the icy water didn't help. Her skin stayed flushed, overly sensitive. Like she was in heat. But she was human. How could a werewolf's heat possibly happen to her? She didn't tell Lily. Didn't mention the dream. Not when they walked to campus, not when they grabbed coffee, not when Lily asked if she was feeling okay. "You look like you haven't slept." 'Cause she hadn't. Not since the rink. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him. That night, again and again. But different. In her dreams, she was back in the locker room, but this time she wanted it. Needed it. Ronan had her pressed up against the cold metal lockers, one hand gripping her jaw, the other ripping open her blouse like it was nothing but tissue paper. "You smell like mine," he growled, voice low and rough against her ear. "Say it." She didn't argue. She couldn't. Her fingers clawed at his back, hips grinding helplessly against the hard bulge straining against his jeans. Then he dropped to his knees. Right there, in the middle of the locker room, he shoved her panties aside and buried his face between her legs. His tongue was unforgiving, devouring her like he'd been starving for days. She gasped, bucked, begged, her hands gripping his hair, her moans echoing off the tiles. "More," she sobbed. "Please, Ronan, don't stop." He didn't. He stood and flipped her around, bending her over the wooden bench like she was made for it. Her palms slapped the surface. Her legs trembled. And when he pushed into her, hard, deep, possessive, she cried out so loudly it woke her. Lyra bolted upright, sheets soaked, thighs slick, heart racing. Her entire body throbbed with need. And worse, she wanted to go back to sleep. Back into that dream. Back to him. It didn't help that her biology professor seemed hell-bent on torturing her. "Today's topic," he announced cheerfully, "is mating instincts." Lyra stiffened in her seat. The lecture hall wasn't full, but she was suddenly hyper-aware of every seat, every breath. Her notebook stayed blank. Now, in certain shifter species, the professor continued, we observe something known as a true mate response, biological recognition. One partner emits a pheromone signature that aligns perfectly with another. Triggers obsession, possession, lust. Someone laughed. Lyra didn't. Her fingers curled into fists in her lap. It's rare. But when it happens, it's irreversible. The bond becomes chemical. Some describe it as maddening. She squeezed her knees together, heat licking up her spine. Interestingly, the professor added, flipping a slide to display two wolves circling one another, in some cases the human side is the last to realize what's happening. The body always knows first. Lyra stared at the screen, heart hammering. Her body definitely knew something. She left the lecture in a daze. Cold air slapped her cheeks, but it didn't clear her head. She needed answers. A diagnosis. Something rational. But no matter how she framed it, hormonal imbalance, stress reaction, maybe a virus, nothing explained the dreams. The heat. The hunger. Or why every time she walked past the hockey rink, her legs went weak. Or why she wanted to be touched. Marked. Taken. By him. And worst of all, why part of her wanted to beg for it. While on the other side, Ronan was feeling weird too. Ronan didn't dream. Not normally. But ever since that night, since he touched her, smelled her, tasted the skin just beneath her jaw, his nights had turned violent. Primal. Wet with sweat and shame. He'd wake up hard, aching, growling into his pillow like some goddamn animal. Because of her. Lyra Wren. She was wrong in every way. Human. Untouched by pack blood. Too soft, too sweet, too curious. She had no idea what she was walking into. And still, his wolf wanted her. No, not wanted. Claimed. Every time she stood by the rink, clipboard in hand, those tight jeans hugging her ass, his control slipped a little more. She smelled like heat and vanilla. Looked like temptation bottled in flesh. And when she smiled at someone else, some freshman, some idiot with a neckbeard, Ronan's hands clenched into fists inside his gloves. He skated faster. Hit harder. Tried to sweat it out. Didn't work. His pack noticed. Eli gave him a look after practice, one that said, "You good, man?" Ronan just growled and yanked off his helmet. He wasn't good. He was losing it. He started avoiding her. On purpose. He arrived late to practice. Left early. Stayed in the locker room when she was on duty. Didn't speak. Didn't look. But he felt her. Every damn time. Her heartbeat shifted when he was near. She got quiet, almost cautious. Like some part of her sensed the predator inside him. Smart girl. He watched her from the far end of the rink when he thought no one would notice. Sometimes through the glass while she cleaned up the med kit. Sometimes during warm-ups when she leaned over the boards to speak to coach. And sometimes, just sometimes, she'd glance up like she knew he was watching. And that look. Fuck. That look made his wolf howl. It was during the annual Hawthorne Sports Fest, an interdepartmental athletic competition held every spring, that things finally snapped. Every club and faculty had their own team. Even the shifters participated, though they had to register in shifter class events to keep things fair. Ronan ran short-distance sprint for the Wolves every year. It was tradition. He told himself it'd be fine. That he wouldn't even see her in the crowd. But the second he stepped onto the track, he scented her. She was near. Wearing shorts too tight, a tank top too thin, her braids swinging down her back as she cheered from the sidelines with her classmates. Sunlight clung to her skin like it belonged there. Her smile nearly knocked the air from his lungs. And when the starting pistol fired, Ronan ran like something was chasing him. He crossed the finish line seconds ahead of everyone else. Broke the campus sprint record. Crowd roared. People shouted his name. But he didn't care. All he cared about was her, standing by the bleachers, watching him like she couldn't look away. Her eyes met his. And it was like something inside him cracked wide open. She wanted him. And she didn't even know what that meant. He skipped the after-party. Jogged straight into the woods behind the athletic complex until his lungs burned and his bones ached. Then he shifted, his wolf form tearing free of his skin, and disappeared into the dark. It was the only way to shut off the noise. The only way to stop himself from doing something he couldn't undo. Because if he stayed near her tonight, he wasn't sure he could keep the monster in. But even the forest didn't help. Not when he closed his eyes and saw her again, this time not in the locker room but in his bed. Naked. Flushed. Begging. In the dream, she straddled him, her thighs tight around his waist, her fingers digging into his chest. She moaned his name with every bounce, her voice raw and breathless. And he just let go. He flipped her over and fucked her into the mattress, his canines grazing her throat, his hand cradling the back of her skull like she was something fragile and precious, and his, only his. He woke up with a snarl in his throat and a hard-on so fierce it hurt. Sweat soaked the sheets. The air reeked of pheromones and frustration. Fuck, he growled, throwing the blanket off. He staggered into the bathroom, splashed water on his face, stared at his own eyes in the mirror. They weren't fully human anymore, just a little too bright, a little too silver. He was shifting in his sleep. Again. He hadn't done that since he was 15. And it wasn't just lust anymore. It was something deeper. Wilder. Instinctive. He could feel the bonds starting to click into place, like some ancient mechanism buried in his blood was waking up and pointing, silently but violently, at her. Lyra. The name felt dangerous on his tongue. He paced for hours that night, shirtless, restless, his body a war zone. He needed to stay away. Yet he wanted to mark her. He needed to never touch her again. Yet he wanted to bend her over the nearest flat surface and fuck her until she couldn't remember her own name. Didn't make sense. She wasn't even wolf. But his instincts didn't care about rules or bloodlines or logic. All they wanted was her. And Ronan Thorne, heir to the Wildclaw Pack, was starting to realize something terrifying. He might not have a choice. Weeks later, Lyra sat on the edge of the exam table, paper gown crinkling beneath her thighs, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The doctor flipped through her chart, brows furrowed. "Well, your test results are mostly unremarkable," he began, in that cautious tone doctors used when they didn't want to alarm the patient too soon. "Vitals are good, no signs of infection, no neurological flags." She waited. But he hesitated. "We did pick up trace levels of a hormonal compound that's uncommon, closely resembles pheromonal markers typically found in shifter biology, specifically those tied to bonding triggers in the werewolf genome." Lyra blinked. "I'm not a shifter." "I know," he said quickly. "Honestly, it's not unheard of for non-shifter students to show mild hormonal anomalies their first semester here. A new environment, new diet, pack-heavy energy around campus, it can throw things off for a while." "So you think it's something I ate?" she said flatly. He gave a sheepish smile. "Or the stress. It'll likely metabolize out of your system once your schedule and lifestyle stabilize." She nodded slowly, pretending that explanation satisfied her. It didn't. Made sense scientifically. It was the kind of rational, logical answer she had been hoping for. And yet, her gut twisted. Because whatever was happening inside her didn't feel random, didn't feel temporary. She spent the entire afternoon in the restricted section of the library, where the shifter biology textbooks were kept behind glass, available only by special request. She lied and said it was for a comparative physiology paper. The librarian didn't ask questions. Most humans didn't. She flipped through dusty tomes and hyper-specific research logs, searching for something, anything, that explained what the hell was happening to her. And there it was. True mate response. She found it in an old pack training manual, buried in a chapter labeled Behavioral Instincts in Alpha-Bonded Pairs. When two beings, shifter or not, are genetically aligned as true mates, the body responds before the mind. Symptoms include increased pheromone output, vivid sexual dreams, unexplained heat sensitivity, and psychological fixation. The response is primal, irreversible, and frequently one-sided at first. Her throat dried. Sounded like her. Sounded like them. But it couldn't be. She wasn't Wolf. She wasn't anything. Just a regular girl with a good GPA and a failed relationship and way too many vivid dreams about a man who barely spoke to her. She slammed the book shut and pressed her forehead against the table. "No. No, no, no. The worst part was, he still wasn't talking to her. Ronan hadn't said a word since the night at the rink. Not during practice. Not in the hallway. Not even when their hands brushed by accident while she passed him an ice pack after a minor injury. But the way he jerked away, like her touch had burned him, told her everything. He felt it too. And it was driving him mad. She caught him staring at her again that evening. She wasn't supposed to be at the late training session. Coach had asked her to drop off supplies, but as she walked past the bleachers, she saw him on the ice. Helmet off. Glistening with sweat. Staring right at her like she'd wandered into his cage. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he skated to the edge, fast, too fast, stopping with a violent spray of ice that dusted her shoes. "You shouldn't be here," he growled. She blinked. "It's not your rink." He stepped closer. Too close. His breath fogged in the space between them. "You don't know what you're doing to me." Her stomach flipped. "Then explain it," she whispered. "Because I'm losing my mind, Ronan. And you act like I did something wrong, like I'm some problem you need to erase." He snarled softly. "You didn't do anything. That's the fucking problem." Her breath caught. "Then why won't you touch me again?" His jaw clenched. She saw the vein in his neck throb, his fingers twitching like he was barely holding himself back. "I can't," he said hoarsely. "Why?" "Because if I do," he leaned in, voice broken, "I won't stop." That sentence haunted in Lyra's brain, and then her wet dreams continued for another few days. She was so confused by the situation. And then, on a quiet night, Lyra stayed late to help Coach with some equipment stuff and was about to leave the ice arena. She didn't expect to hear growling. Low. Rough. Animal. First, she thought maybe someone had left the speakers on. Or maybe the guys were messing around after hours. But then she saw him. Ronan. Alone on the ice. Shirtless. Chest rising and falling like he'd just run a marathon. His back glistened with sweat, muscles jerking like something was moving underneath his skin. Then he dropped to his knees and let out a sound that wasn't human. Bones cracked. His hands hit the ice and twisted, shifted into claws. Fur burst through his skin, fast and violent. His body grew, stretched, and morphed until he was gone. And in his place stood something massive. A werewolf. All muscle and shadow and snarling teeth, covered in thick dark fur. His eyes glowed, burning silver. He looked like a nightmare pulled straight out of a horror movie, and yet somehow worse. 'Cause this was real. He was real. He moved. Quick. Too quick. His claws tore across the ice like they weighed nothing. His body was low, stalking, pure predator. Lyra didn't think, she just ran. Her boots slipped against the slick tile as she bolted for the locker room doors. Panic ripped through her chest. She didn't care where she was going, she just needed to be anywhere but here. She didn't make it. Her foot caught on the edge of the mat. Her ankle twisted. She went down hard with a cry, palms slamming the floor. Before she could scramble back up, something heavy landed behind her. Breathing. Hot. Loud. Right behind her ear. She turned, and there he was. Ronan. Back in human form, but barely. His chest still heaved. His eyes still burned silver. His muscles shook like they were ready to shift again. He was naked from the waist up, skin flushed, wild and damp with sweat. His hands flexed at his sides like he didn't trust them. "Stay back," Lyra breathed. He didn't. He stepped toward her. One step. Then another. Slow. Controlled, but barely. "Don't," she whispered. "I told you to stay away from me," he growled. She pressed back against the locker, heart pounding so loud it drowned everything else. "You shifted." "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "You weren't supposed to see that." Well, too late. She was shaking. Her entire body buzzed with fear and something else. Something hotter. Deeper. He moved closer. Just one more step. "Don't come near me," she said again, but it came out weak. Shaky. He stopped inches away. "You have no idea what you're doing to me." Her stomach flipped. Her hands curled against the lockers. Then explain it. I can't. His voice broke. Because if I do, I won't stop. And then he was right there. His hand slid along her jaw, fingers trembling like he hated himself for touching her, but couldn't stop. He leaned down, and his mouth found her throat. He didn't bite, didn't mark, just breathed her in. His lips grazed her skin, soft, slow, like a prayer he didn't believe in. Then his tongue flicked across that spot under her jaw, the one that had been burning ever since their first encounter. Her body lit up like a struck match. Lyra let out a sound she didn't recognize. Her hands fisted in his arms. She hated how good it felt. Hated how badly she wanted him to keep going. He pulled back like he'd been punched. Staggered a step away, breathing hard. I can't mark you, he said, more to himself than her. You're not ready. I'll ruin you. His voice cracked. Then he turned and shoved the door open, disappearing into the night like something was chasing him. Lyra stood there, knees weak, heart pounding out of control, throat still tingling where his mouth had been. And she just didn't expect things would get even worse. The annual sports medicine showcase came. It was supposed to be chill, professional. Some dry-ass demo on athlete evaluations for pre-med and kin students. Zero drama, zero heat. Until she saw his name on her rotation chart. Ronan Thorn Ice Wolves captain. Of course. Fucking course. She hadn't slept the night before. Not really. Her neck still tingled from where his mouth had been, and her dreams had been one endless mess of teeth, hands, and shameful, desperate need. And now she had to put her hands on him, in public. In front of faculty. Awesome. The auditorium was packed. Students, trainers, even her professor watching like a damn hawk. Lyra, you're up, he called. Standard shoulder and cervical assessment on Mr. Thorne. She swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Ronan was already on the bench, shirtless, sweat slicked, golden under the lights. Every muscle looked carved out of sin. He didn't look at her. Not really. But she felt him. Tension rolling off his body was thick enough to taste. She stepped closer. Tried to remember how to breathe. Just be clinical. Just be professional. Starting with shoulder mobility, she murmured, more to herself than to him. I'm going to. Her fingers brushed his upper arm. His breath hitched. She froze. Looked up. His jaw was locked. Eyes closed like he was trying not to break something. Don't think. Just move. She pushed through the assessment, joint alignment, muscle tension, clavicle symmetry. And then she touched the base of his neck. That one spot. Everything snapped. His hand shot up, wrapped around her wrist. Not rough, just firm. Don't, he said, voice low and wrecked. Don't touch me there. She stopped breathing. Heat coiled up her spine, her body hyper-aware. His pulse, his scent, his skin under her hand. Dark. Earthy. Wild. She nodded, pulling back slowly. Too late. His eyes opened, and they weren't calm. They were feral. And for one terrifying second, she swore she smelled her own scent shift in the air. Sweet. Sharp. Hungry. Pheromones. Oh God. Her fingers shook as she finished. She nodded stiffly at the professor and slipped out fast. The equipment room was quiet. Dim smelled like rubbing alcohol and old gauze. She dropped onto the bench, hands trembling. You're fine. It's over. You didn't die. Then the door creaked. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She knew it was him. Ronan stepped inside, closed the door behind him with a soft click. Don't, she said before he could speak. I followed protocol. I didn't do anything wrong. I know, he said. Too close. She turned, and there he was. Again. You want to tell me what you're doing? She asked, backing up until her spine hit the lockers. His eyes burned. I tried to stay away. You failed. I know. Silence crackled between them like static. Then he stepped closer. Lyra, he said her name like it hurt. You don't get it. When you touched that spot, my wolf wanted to break out. Right there. In front of everyone. Her stomach flipped. That's not my fault. I never said it was. Then why did he look at her like she was the curse? His hand came up slowly, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. She didn't flinch, didn't breathe. Tell me to stop, he whispered. She didn't. So he didn't. He leaned in, lips grazing her jaw, then sliding lower, down her neck to the spot they both remembered. His breath hitched. And then he licked there. Lyra gasped, knees buckling. Her whole body lit up, core throbbing. A moan caught in her throat before she could swallow it down. She should have shoved him off. She didn't. Her hands fisted in his shoulders like she needed them just to stay standing. She felt her own scent bloom in the air, syrupy sweet and impossible to hide. He growled, low and hungry. And then suddenly, like waking from a trance, he jerked back. Like she'd burned him. His chest rose and fell fast. Eyes wide. Hands shaking. Then he turned and left, slamming the door behind him like if he didn't run, he'd tear the room apart. Lyra slid to the floor, breath shallow, pulse wild. Her skin still burned where his tongue had touched. And for the first time, she wasn't scared of what she was turning into. She was scared of how much she wanted it. The next morning, Lyra still felt the ghost of his tongue on her skin. She'd barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ronan's face, wild and wrecked. She didn't have the answers. Only questions. And this morning, she didn't want to face any of them. So when Lily begged her to come to the Cross-College Open Course Expo, some boring thing the school did every semester to advertise electives and showcase new research, she said yes without arguing. At least it was something to do. They ducked into a psychology lecture mid-morning, slid into the back row with iced coffees and zero expectations. Professor was funny, and the topic, pack bond trauma recovery, was interesting enough. Lily was actually taking notes for once. By the break, Lyra had started to relax. Until the lights dimmed again. And the dean walked on stage. "We'll be resuming shortly," he said into the mic. "But before we begin, we'd like to welcome a new addition to our academic community. A top-ranked transfer from the Eastern Territories. Please join me in welcoming Cassiel of the Vire Coven Pack." The room shifted. Someone actually gasped. Lyra sat up straighter as a tall figure stepped onto the stage beside the dean. Sharp suit, platinum hair, glacier blue eyes. He moved like he was carved from marble and fully aware of it. Composed. Controlled. Dangerous in a silent scalpel kind of way. Nothing about him was warm. Nothing about him was human. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply scanned the room once with eyes like polished steel, cold, unblinking, and said, "Thank you for having me." His voice was velvet wrapped around a razor. The room fell utterly silent. Lily leaned in. "Holy shit. That's Cassiel Vale." "You know him?" Lyra whispered. "He's an Alpha heir. Vire Coven Pack. They're pure-blood royal lineage. Think old money, old magic, zero tolerance for bullshit. I didn't even know they let their kids transfer." Lyra kept her eyes on the stage. Cassiel didn't look at anyone in particular, but for one fraction of a second, Lyra could have sworn he paused on her. And when he turned away, her heart was beating way too fast. Lyra tried not to think too much of it. Maybe he hadn't looked at her. Maybe she'd imagined the pause. Pressure of those eyes. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling. Even after the break ended, even as the lecture droned on, she was half listening, half glancing toward the side of the room where Cassiel had taken a seat near the faculty. He sat perfectly still, hands folded, eyes focused, posture flawless. Not once did he shift in his chair. Not once did he fidget or blink too long. He was like a statue dressed in a school blazer. And still, she felt watched. Not threatened. Just observed. After the seminar, she and Lily made their way into the quad, where booths were set up for various electives. Professors pitched their courses. Flyers fluttered in the breeze. Someone was handing out free energy drinks. Lyra had just accepted one when she heard a voice behind her. Calm. Crisp. Precise. "Excuse me. Miss Wren, is it?" She turned. Cassiel Vale stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets, gaze steady on hers. Her spine straightened on instinct. Yes," He nodded once. I hope I'm not being forward. I simply wanted to introduce myself properly. I believe we're both enrolled in biogenetics this term. She blinked. Right. Yeah, I didn't realize. I noticed your name on the lab roster. His tone was flat. Factual. Like he was reciting data. I'm Cassiel Vale. I know, she said before she could stop herself. That made him tilt his head, just slightly. Almost curious. His eyes flicked to Lily beside her, then back. Would it be all right if I walked with you? Lily's eyes practically sparkled. Actually, she said quickly, I just remembered I have a thing. Over there. Far away. She vanished in the next heartbeat. Cassiel said nothing. Lyra nodded awkwardly and they started walking. He didn't speak right away. Didn't push. Just matched her pace with quiet, perfectly measured steps. You're not what I expected, he said eventually. Lyra glanced at him. What's that supposed to mean? Cassiel considered her for a second longer than necessary. I expected someone more rattled. This place isn't easy for humans. Sorry, have we met before? She asked instinctively, her tone edged with a hint of caution. He gave the ghost of a smile. Or maybe you're more than you think. Something cold bloomed under her skin. She didn't respond. They walked a few more paces in silence, and when they reached the edge of the quad, he paused. I'll see you in class, Lyra. And then he was gone. From across the courtyard, Ronan watched all of it. His jaw tight. His fists in his pockets. And for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hated more than his own hunger. A rival. Lyra just wanted one quiet night. No wolves. No tension. No questions she didn't want to ask herself. Just books, a study carrel, and the smell of ink and old paper. She tucked herself into the far corner of the library's second floor, where the overhead lights buzzed faintly and barely anyone came after dark. She was halfway through a case study when she felt it. That shift in the air. Like something unseen had entered the room. Like a storm rolling in with no sound. She looked up, and he was already there. Cassiel Vale. Standing at the edge of her table, posture perfect, expression unreadable. Lyra Wren, he said calmly. You're alone. Her mouth went dry. It's a library. I didn't expect you to smell like this when you're focused. She blinked. Excuse me. He took a step forward. Then another. She stood on instinct. Is there something you need? I ran the scan through our pack's matching algorithm, he said like he was discussing a lab report. Your genetic markers sync with mine. 100% match. It's already been logged. Our true mate bond is confirmed. Her stomach twisted. That's not possible. It is, he said simply. It's rare, but not impossible. You're a statistical anomaly, human, unknown lineage, but it happens. He moved even closer, and suddenly the space between them wasn't air, it was pressure. Hot. Heavy. Her knees buckled slightly. She smelled it before she even registered what he was doing. Pheromones. Thick. Sweet. Metallic. Like blood and heat and control. He was releasing his alpha scent. On purpose. Stop, she breathed, stepping back. You can't just... I'm not hurting you, he said. Your body is responding. That's normal. He reached for her wrist. She flinched. His fingers wrapped around her anyway, cool and firm like iron cuffs. The heat in her belly surged. Her pulse pounded between her legs. Her breath came too fast, too shallow. Her body was responding. She hated it. You don't understand what this means yet, Cassiel said, voice low and certain. But you will. This bond isn't about choice. It's about biology. You belong. She doesn't belong to you. The voice was pure gravel and fury. Ronan. He stood behind Cassiel, fists clenched, his eyes molten silver. His scent hit the air immediately, spicy, wild, electric. Clashed with Cassiel's like oil and water, two storms colliding mid-sky. Cassiel didn't turn around. You're interfering in a confirmed claim. She didn't claim you back. Finally, Cassiel turned. The two Alpha heirs squared off in the silence of the library, surrounded by shelves and ancient binding glue and a girl who suddenly couldn't breathe. Lyra stumbled back as the air thickened, the kind of weight that pressed into her skull, her chest, her thighs. She felt dizzy. Hot. Like she'd just been dropped in the middle of a storm that wanted to eat her alive. "You're out of control," Cassiel said. "I could report you to the Werewolf Council." "Do it," Ronan snapped. "Then explain why a visiting heir was sent marking a girl without consent." That made Cassiel's jaw twitch. His fingers loosened around her wrist. She yanked it free, gasping for air like she'd been underwater. But it didn't help. 'Cause both of them were still there, burning, radiating alpha heat, and she was caught in the middle. Her knees gave out and she grabbed the table to steady herself. Her skin was on fire. Her thoughts swam. Lyra, Ronan was at her side instantly. Cassiel stepped back. "She's overwhelmed. Her body's recalibrating. She's not a fucking lab sample. She's my match. She's not yours." The growl that came out of Ronan didn't sound human. Neither did the one Cassiel answered with. And then the room snapped. The two Alpha heirs lunged forward. Not fists, not claws, just raw energy colliding. The bookshelves shuddered. Light flickered overhead. Lyra's vision blurred as her body buckled under the weight of them both. Her limbs turned liquid. Her core pulsed with heat. And somewhere in the rising haze, she realized, if they didn't stop soon, she was going to pass out. She didn't hear how the fight ended. 1 second, her vision had blurred, Ronan and Cassiel lunging like twin storms, all teeth and rage, and the next, everything went black. Just heat. Then nothing. She woke up shivering. Cold air sliced across her skin like knives. Her lashes fluttered open, blinking against the dim, blue-tinted light. The walls around her glowed faintly with frost. Somewhere above, a vent hummed low and steady. The ice room. She was in the Wolves' recovery chamber, a literal walk-in freezer where players cooled down after games to lower core temps and stop inflammation. She tried to sit up, and instantly regretted it. Her whole body felt like jello, muscles limp, limbs trembling like she'd just finished a marathon. And her shirt. Oh God. Her shirt was half unbuttoned. Collar loose. Her jacket was gone. Her shoes too. Heat exploded across her cheeks. Her heart jumped into her throat. Had someone undressed her? Hey, you're awake. The voice came from her right. She turned and saw him. Ronan. He was sitting on the bench beside her cot, elbows on his knees, jaw tight. But the second she looked at him, his storm-gray eyes softened. "You passed out," he said quietly. "In the library." She tried to speak. Her throat was dry. I don't, how?" "You were overheating," he said, voice careful low. "The nurses said your vitals were spiking like a shifter in bond heat. But you're not one." So they had no clue what to do. She blinked slowly, her brain swimming through fog. "You carried me?" Ronan nodded once. Cassiel tried. "I didn't let him." Her stomach twisted. He leaned forward a little, frustration bleeding into his tone. "You were burning up. I brought you here. This was the only place cold enough to bring you down without sedating you. Nobody touched you. I swear." She looked down, fumbling with the edges of her shirt, trying to pull it closed. Her fingers were still shaking. His eyes flicked away like he didn't want to make things worse. "I tried not to look," he muttered. "Your scent was everywhere. I didn't want to. I stayed in the far corner. Until now." Something cracked open in her chest at that. The guilt in his voice. The restraint. Control it must have taken not to. She swallowed hard. "Thank you." He nodded, didn't say anything. Silence stretched. Then, gently, "What did he do to you?" She didn't answer. Because she didn't know how to explain it. The rush. The pressure. The way Cassiel's presence had short-circuited her body, like he'd triggered some kind of genetic switch she didn't know she had. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I'm not a wolf. I'm human. I shouldn't be feeling any of this." Ronan's jaw tightened. "But you did." With him. Question landed sharp. jealous, but not cruel, just wounded. I don't know what I felt, she said honestly. But when you walked in, it felt different. He looked at her then. Really looked. Not like she was a stranger. Not like a problem. Not like a prize. But like she was a riddle he didn't know how to solve. Something dangerous. Something fragile. I shouldn't be here, he said, standing. You need to rest. But she reached out. Her fingers curled gently around his wrist. He turned, and she didn't let go. Ronan, she said quietly. What's happening to me? He stared down at her hand against his skin. And when he spoke, his voice was so soft it almost broke. I wish to hell I knew. Some point after Ronan left, Lyra drifted off again. She hadn't meant to. One moment she was lying there, cold seeping into her skin. The next, heat. Not physical heat. Not from the freezing air or the thin blanket someone had tossed over her. This was inside her. Heavy. Deep. Crawling under her skin like smoke and fire. She was in a forest. Dark. Wet. Pine needles soft under her feet. Mist curling between the trees like breath. She was barefoot. Bare-skinned. Her body glowed pale under the moonlight. She should have been cold. But she wasn't. She was burning. And she wasn't alone. Two shadows moved between the trees. Massive. Low. Predatory. Wolves. Both of them were pitch black, too big to be normal. Muscles rippling under fur like midnight oil, eyes gleaming silver and ice blue. Ronan. Cassiel. Even in wolf form she knew them. Felt them. And they saw her. They didn't speak. Didn't growl. Just moved. Circling her. Talking. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But she didn't. She stood still, chest rising and falling, heart pounding so hard it echoed through the clearing. She wanted them. No, needed them. Their presence pulled something raw out of her. Something primal. A hunger she didn't understand but couldn't deny. One of them brushed against her leg, thick fur and heat and power. The other nudged her hip, tongue flicking over her skin. She gasped, head falling back. And then teeth. Not biting. Not hurting. Claiming. Licking. Nuzzling. Pressing. One wolf moved behind her, large and solid, forcing her forward. The other lowered his head between her thighs. She cried out. Her body arched, every nerve lit up like fire. She should have been terrified. But all she felt was surrender. Complete. Willing. Desperate. Their bodies caged her in, fur and heat and breath all around. Her legs spread open instinctively. Her thighs trembled. Her skin burned. She moaned as one wolf nuzzled her neck and the other licked her center like he knew exactly how to break her open. She was shaking, writhing, clawing at the ground. And when her release hit, hot and wild and uncontrollable, she screamed. She jolted awake, gasping. The ice room was still dim, still quiet. But her body, oh God. Her thighs were soaked. Her skin flushed and fever-warm. Her core throbbed, empty and aching. Her heartbeat pounded against her ribs like a warning. She sat up, hand covering her mouth. She wanted to cry. She didn't know who she was anymore. All she knew was that something inside her had changed. Next, the team party. Lyra hated parties. Too loud. Too crowded. Too many people packed into a space that smelled like cheap beer, body spray, and testosterone. She wasn't a drinker, didn't like dancing, and definitely had no interest in watching half the hockey team get drunk enough to start stripping. But Coach had invited her personally. And when your job was tied to the highest profile sports program on campus, you didn't say no to Coach. So she came. Black jeans. A burgundy top. Her safest lipstick. Not bold. Not soft. Just enough to disappear into the crowd. She tried to hover near the drinks table. Quiet. Background. It didn't last. He found her in 10 minutes. Cassiel veil. Perfectly dressed, as always. Hair flawless. Color crisp. He moved through the party like the room bent around him, like people instinctively knew to give him space. He stopped right in front of her, like it was already decided. Dance with me. It wasn't a question. Lyra straightened. I don't really. He held out a hand. The music shifted. Slower. Thicker bass. Somehow, the crowd melted just enough to make room. Her heart kicked. Her feet didn't move. Cassiel, I don't. Just one dance, he said, cool and smooth and impossible to refuse. She put her hand in his like it didn't belong to her. His palm landed low on her back, just above her hips. Not inappropriate. Not yet. But she felt it. Felt him. The heat. The tension. Control. And then there was the scent. Familiar. Sharp. Deliberate. He was doing it again. Leaking alpha pheromones, quietly, subtly, but enough to mess with her balance, her focus, her breath. Her body betrayed her. Again. You're responding, he murmured near her ear. You were born for this. She stiffened. Stop. You're doing it again. You need to understand what you are. No, you need to understand I'm not. Get your hands off her. The growl came from the edge of the dance floor. Ronan. His voice sliced through the music. Lyra turned just as he pushed through the crowd, silver eyes glowing, jaw so tight she swore she heard it crack. Cassiel didn't blink. This is a private moment. Ronan didn't stop. He stepped between them in a heartbeat, grabbed Lyra's wrist, pulled her free like it was nothing. She doesn't want this. You can't speak for her. I don't have to. Look at her. Only then did Lyra realize she was shaking. Cold outside air hit her face like a slap. Ronan walked fast, dragging her half a step behind until they reached the edge of the courtyard. Then he stopped, turned, and dropped her wrist. What the hell were you thinking? I didn't want to dance with him, she shot back. Then why didn't you walk away? I don't know. Her voice cracked. I couldn't. He's too much. He was scenting you. In public. Her cheeks burned. I know. Ronan's hands curled into fists. You think this is a game, Lyra? That he wants you for you? I don't know what anyone wants anymore. The silence hit hard. Lyra's breath caught. Her voice dropped. I don't even know what I want. The words broke something open. And so did she. Tears welled up, fast, hot, impossible to stop. One slipped down her cheek before she could blink it away. Then another. And another. She turned away from him, hands swiping across her face, but it only smeared the wetness. Shit, she muttered. Sorry. I didn't mean to. Lyra, Ronan said softly. She didn't look at him. Didn't want him to see her like this. But he stepped closer anyway. His voice gentler now. Quieter. I shouldn't have yelled. I wasn't thinking about how this feels for you. She sniffed, still facing away. It's a lot. I know. He hesitated. Like he wanted to say more. So much more. But he didn't. Because if he told her the truth, that he'd wanted to rip Cassiel apart, not just for touching her but for confusing her, he wouldn't be able to stop there. If he told her how badly he wanted to pull her close, mark her skin with his mouth, bury his face in her neck and finally give in to everything he'd been fighting, she might say yes. But not because she wanted him. 'Cause she was scared. 'Cause she was overwhelmed. Because her body was in chaos and didn't know how to say no. And that was not he wanted. So he stepped back. You should get some sleep. She finally turned, eyes red, lips trembling. He wanted to kiss her. So badly. But he left. Lyra didn't talk to either of them for 3 full days. Not Ronan. Not Cassiel. Not even Lily. Her roommate, to her credit, finally took the hint and stopped asking. Instead, she just started tossing protein bars onto Lyra's desk like she was feeding a malfunctioning cat. Lyra buried herself in class notes and lecture slides, skipped every training session, and told anyone who asked that she was sick. Headache, sore throat, bad cough. You name it. She told herself she just needed space. She didn't tell herself she was still waking up every morning flushed and aching. She didn't admit that more than once in the middle of class, a single memory, a look, a kiss, had sent her fleeing to the bathroom for cold water and deep breaths. The dreams didn't stop. Neither did the pole. And this wasn't just about them anymore. This was about whatever the hell was happening inside her. So when Coach texted late Tuesday night asking for medical backup on a solo endurance session, no contact, just laps, she almost didn't respond. Wolves Arena. 11:30 p.m. One skater. Bring the med kit. She was already typing out a polite sorry, can't make it when she opened the schedule. One name. Ronan Thorne. The rink was empty. Lights turned low, the ice glowing faintly blue under the overhead beams. Cold cut through the air, sharp enough to sting her nose. Every breath turned to fog. He was already there. Alone in a gray hoodie, sleeves shoved up to his forearms. His hair was damp like he'd just rinsed it, but his expression was restless. Unsettled. Like even the ice wasn't enough to cool him down. He looked up when she stepped through the doors, her bag slung over her shoulder. I figured you wouldn't show. She dropped the bag by the bench. So did I. The silence between them stretched, tight, humming like there was still gunpowder in the air from their last fight. Then he pushed off the edge of the rink, gliding toward her with that usual fluid control. Come on, he said. You know how to skate, don't you? She raised an eyebrow. You asked the coach to drag me here for that? He didn't deny it. Just held out his hand. Skate with me. She didn't say yes. But she still laced up her skates. First, her balance sucked. Her legs wobbled. But his hand was firm on her lower back, steadying her without a word. He led her in wide loops around the ice, correcting her only when necessary. Loosen your arms. You're thinking too hard. Breathe, Lyra. She hated how natural he sounded saying her name. Hated how her pulse jumped every time his hand brushed her hip or his fingers grazed her wrist. Even the lightest touch sent sparks skittering down her spine. By the third lap, a heat had started to build in her chest. By the fourth, she wasn't sure if it was adrenaline or something far more dangerous. He suddenly caught her hand, guiding her into a tighter spin. Their skates bumped. Their chests nearly touched. You're still tense, he said, voice low. Gee, I wonder why. You're resisting. Resisting what, exactly? He didn't answer. Just looked at her. Those storm-gray eyes, cold as frost, burning like fire. Then he leaned down and brushed a kiss across her forehead. It was barely a touch. But it lit her up like a fuse. Her lips parted. A shaky breath slipped out. His hand slid down her arm, slipping beneath her jacket sleeve, fingers grazing her bare skin. She shivered. Ronan. You feel it, he murmured, voice rough like it cost him to say it. Don't pretend you don't. She wanted to deny it. But her body betrayed her first. Her breath hitched. Her knees almost gave out. You can't run from this, he said softly. Then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't hesitant. It was claiming. Her fingers curled into the front of his hoodie as his mouth pressed against hers, slow, deep, scorching. His scent surrounded her, wild and clean, sharp and grounding. All alpha. But not overwhelming. Just enough to make her want to drown in it. Her skate slipped slightly on the ice and he caught her instantly. But he didn't stop kissing her. Didn't rush it either. He kissed like he wanted to memorize every inch of her, every tremble, every shaky exhale, every time she leaned in instead of pulling away. When he finally pulled back, her breath was wrecked. Her lips were swollen, glossy, her chest rising and falling like she couldn't get enough air. And his eyes, still locked on hers, held something fierce. Like he was daring her to say no. But she didn't. This isn't just a moment, he said, voice low. It's not going away. This wasn't just a kiss. It was a line they'd crossed. And neither of them was turning back. The next day, Lyra had found an old bench beneath a flowering dogwood, cracked open a book she wasn't really reading, and let her thoughts drift to, unsurprisingly, Ronan. The way he kissed her. The way he looked at her afterward like she was something precious and terrifying all at once. Her heart still hadn't slowed since that night on the ice. Her body definitely hadn't. And for the first time in days, she wasn't hiding from it. She was letting herself feel it, until a shadow blocked the sun. "You've got some nerve sitting here like you belong." The voice was sharp, feminine, laced with sugar and venom. Sienna, head cheerleader, pack princess, and of course, Ronan's ex. Lyra looked up slowly, instantly regretting it. Sienna stood over her, arms crossed, glossy lips curved into something cold and cruel. Two other girls hovered behind her like backup dancers in a bad teen drama. "I'm just sitting," Lyra said, trying to keep her voice even. Sienna laughed, short and fake. "Oh honey, you're doing way more than that. Half the school's talking. First Ronan, now Cassiel? Damn. You move fast." Lyra stood. "You done?" Sienna took a step closer. Not even close. She wasn't yelling. She didn't need to. Her voice was the kind that crawled under your skin, sharp with pack-born arrogance and the confidence of someone who thought they couldn't be touched. "You really think a human like you can keep up with someone like Ronan?" Sienna sneered. "You don't know the first thing about what he needs. About what we are." Lyra didn't flinch. Didn't speak. But her fingers curled into fists at her sides. Sienna saw it. Smirked. "Let me help you understand," she whispered, leaning in close. "Ronan? He likes to play with fragile things." Her breath was hot against Lyra's ear. "You're a toy. Passing thrill. And when he breaks you, he won't even look back." Lyra's throat tightened. "But then..." Sienna stepped back, eyes gleaming. "Then there's Cassiel. Gorgeous, cold, untouchable. Or at least he was, until you started letting him scent you in public like a bitch in heat." Lyra's mouth opened, but she didn't get the chance to speak. 'Cause suddenly, he was there. Cassiel, peering out of nowhere like he'd torn through space just to get to her. His hand slammed against the stone wall beside Sienna's head, not touching her but close enough that she flinched hard, stumbling back. His eyes were glacier blue and lethal. "Step back," he said, voice like crushed ice. Sienna froze. "Cassiel." "Don't speak to her again," he said coldly. "Not here. Not ever." One of Sienna's friends tried to pull her away. The other was already halfway gone. Cassiel didn't even look at them. His focus was locked on Sienna. And only Sienna. "You think bloodline gives you the right to tear others down?" he asked, calm as death. "Touch her again and I'll make you regret every word that left your mouth." Sienna's mouth opened. Closed. She looked shaken. Small. Didn't happen often. I didn't touch her." "You tried," he said. And then he turned away. Walked straight to Lyra. She didn't even realize she was trembling until he touched her. Hands firm, steady, pulling her into his chest like the world might end. "You okay?" he murmured. She nodded against him. But she wasn't. Not really. Not when her heart was hammering. Not when the scent of his cologne was this close. Not when her whole body still buzzed with the memory of Sienna's words. Cassiel looked down at her, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I warned them once," he said. "There won't be a second time." Behind them, Sienna had vanished. That night, Lyra didn't sleep again. Not even close. She tossed under the thin blanket, sweating, restless. The window was cracked, a sharp spring breeze cutting through the dorm room, but her body still burned, hot and tight like something was coiled under her skin. Ronan's kiss still lingered in her bones. Cassiel's cold fingers brushing her cheek in the garden still buzzed beneath her skin. And worst of all, her body responded to both of them. She hadn't gone near the rink in days. Ignored her phone. Dodged Lily. None of it worked. Sometime past midnight, she sat up, hugged her knees, and stared into the dark. Their voices echoed in her head like ghosts. Ronan's rough whisper, "You're mine." Cassiel's velvet warning, "Your pheromones are waking up." "Shut up," she muttered, dragging herself into the bathroom and splashing cold water on her face. The mirror didn't help. She barely recognized the girl staring back at her. Flushed. Dazed. Wanting. Her phone buzzed. She picked it up with a half-shaky hand. It was Eli. "Lyra, what did you do?" Ronan just smashed the weight room mirror. Whole team's freaked. Before she could process that, another message popped in. It was from Ronan. Open the door. I'm outside. Her stomach dropped. She threw on a sweatshirt, shoved her fingers through her hair, and barely made it to the door before the pounding started. Not knocking. Pounding. She opened it. Ronan stood there, hoodie unzipped, chest rising and falling like he'd run the whole way here. His silver eyes burned straight into her. Tell me he didn't touch you. Her brain stalled. What? Cassiel. After the garden. Did he touch you again? He helped me, she said quietly. Ronan stepped inside. Too close. She backed up on instinct. He followed, shutting the door with a sharp thud. Helped you, he snapped. He held you. In front of everyone. You let him mark you with his scent. It wasn't like that. Then what the hell was it, Lyra? Her spine hit the wall. He slammed a hand beside her head, close, not touching, but enough to trap her. His heat rolled over her, thick with alpha tension, barely contained. I can still smell him on you, he growled. Her fists clenched at her sides. Why do you care? That cracked something in him. He hit the wall again, louder this time. Not to scare her. Just to let it out. Because he doesn't get to have you, Ronan said through gritted teeth. Because you're not his. I'm not yours either, she said, voice shaking. His eyes locked on hers. Aren't you? She couldn't answer. Her heart was racing too loud. You think I don't know what's happening to you? His voice dropped, low and rough. The dreams. The heat. The way your scent changes when you say his name. You're reacting to both of us. And I hate it. I hate that I can't stop it. He stepped back. He looked at her like she was a war he couldn't win, but still couldn't stop fighting. I'm not going to break down your door again, he said quietly. But you need to make a choice. Lyra swallowed. Her voice barely came out. I don't even know what I want. He held her gaze a beat longer, then gave a tight nod. Figure it out, Lyra. Fast. Because I won't stand on the sidelines while he circles you like you already belong to him. Then he turned and walked out. The door clicked shut. She slid down the wall and hit the floor, breathless. By morning, her nerves were frayed, her limbs heavy. She was running on coffee, adrenaline, and the kind of confusion that wrapped itself around your spine and refused to let go. The Wolves had a spring exhibition match that day. Everyone knew what it really was. Wildclaw Pack versus Vire Coven Pack. A full pack dominance flex. And of course, Ronan and Cassiel were the captains. Lyra was assisting the med team like usual. But the second she stepped into the arena, she knew she shouldn't have come. The energy was off. The whole place buzzed with anticipation and barely concealed aggression. Even the coaches looked nervous. Crowd was rowdy and the stands packed with students, some for the sport, others for the show. Everyone wanted to see the two alpha heirs on the same ice. Whispers followed her as she walked along the bench. A few of the cheerleaders stared openly, sneering behind their hands. One of them, Sienna's second-in-command probably, nudged the girl beside her and rolled her eyes in Lyra's direction. That's her, someone whispered. The human they're fighting over. Lyra felt her cheeks heat. She kept her eyes forward. The sideline wasn't much better. A few of her classmates, mostly juniors from the health sciences division, eyed her with thinly veiled curiosity. Only Coach offered a shred of normalcy. As he walked past, he paused beside her for just a second, speaking under his breath. Don't pay attention to them, he said. Focus on what you're here for. Lyra nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. But by the second period, the tension had turned dangerous. Cassiel scored on a tight breakaway, slicing through defenders and snapping the puck into the top corner. Ronan was right behind him, and instead of letting the play go, he slammed into Cassiel full force, shoulder to shoulder, sending both of them crashing into the boards. The arena gasped. The whistle blew. Too late. Cassiel shoved him off. Ronan didn't back down. They ripped off their gloves and helmets like they'd been waiting for it. And then they went at each other. Punches landed. Teeth bared. The kind of fight that wasn't about hockey anymore. Lyra stared in horror as blood hit the ice. Cassiel took a shot to the jaw. Ronan took one to the ribs. It was messy, raw, real. Took 3 teammates and a coach to drag them apart. 10 minutes later, Lyra stood in the medical room. The door was shut. The air was still. They were each on opposite sides of the room. Ronan sat on the exam bench, holding a bloody ice pack to his cheek. His knuckles were raw and split. Cassiel leaned against the counter, silently dabbing a tissue at the corner of his mouth. His expression unreadable. Cold. Focused. Neither of them looked at each other. They didn't look at her either. The silence made her sick. "I'm not a prize you get to fight over," Lyra said finally. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. That made them move. Cassiel looked up first. Ronan slowly lowered the ice pack. "I'm not some object you punch each other over like I don't get a say. If either of you actually cared about me," she said, "you'd ask what I want." More silence. Ronan's voice came next. Low. Hoarse. "So what do you want, Lyra?" She looked at him. Then at Cassiel. And for the first time, she didn't lie to herself. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't have the answer yet." Next. The Vire Coven Research Center was exactly what Lyra expected, clean, modern, and cold. The walls were soft gray. The air smelled like ozone and disinfectant. Even the plants in the courtyard looked fake, cut too perfectly, too symmetrical. It didn't feel like a hospital. Felt like a place that hated mess. 2 days had passed since the Wolves exhibition match, the fight, the stares, the way Ronan looked at her like she was already gone. She hadn't spoken to him. Or Cassiel. But that morning there was a knock at her door. Cassiel stood outside in a black coat, calm as ever, holding a folder. "If you're willing, I'd like to run a few more tests for you," he said. "Our facility is better equipped than the school's. You deserve answers." He didn't mention mates. Or feelings. Or what happened on the ice. So she said yes. Day 1 was all lab tests. Scans. Blood draws. Skin patches. Cassiel stood behind the glass window the whole time, hands behind his back, saying nothing. He didn't speak until lunch. Cafeteria was full of tasteless nutrition bars and gray protein shakes. Lyra made a face and grabbed some ice cream from the fridge. Cassiel watched her. "You've never had this?" she asked. "I wasn't allowed sugar growing up." "You make it sound like a banned substance." He hesitated, then took a spoonful. His whole body jerked. She laughed. "Too much." He blinked slowly. "I think I understand why humans eat it. It feels like being comforted." She smiled. "Told you." Later, they walked through the garden. It was quiet. Peaceful. He showed her the memory archive, a building that stored recorded memories from old Alpha bloodlines. They stopped at a projection called The Last Luna of Winterfall. A silver-haired woman stood in front of a burning village, arms outstretched to protect others. "She gave herself up," Cassiel said. "That Alpha wasn't even her mate." Lyra nodded. She still loved him. Cassiel frowned. But it wasn't logical. Why would someone die for someone they aren't bound to? "Because emotions don't always make sense," Lyra said. "Sometimes love is the choice. Even if it hurts." He was quiet for a while. "So, emotions are like choosing the wrong answer on purpose?" She stared. "You seriously need to date someone?" He blinked. Would that help clarify the concept? She almost dropped her tea from laughing. That night, in the break room, Lyra peeled the wrapper and took a bite of a cupcake. Cassiel just stared. "What?" she asked. "You're getting frosting on your sleeve," he said. She looked. "It's fine." He pulled out a handkerchief from his jacket, then paused. "Would you like me to?" She held out her wrist. "Knock yourself out, Mr. Perfect." He wiped the frosting carefully. "Precisely." "You're such a perfectionist," she said. "I was trained to maintain discipline in all things," he replied. Then, a beat later, "But I don't mind helping you." Her breath caught. The morning started with something that almost felt like peace. Cassiel knocked softly before entering the garden. Lyra was already there, curled on a bench with a cup of bitter tea, wrapped in one of the research center's 2 white blankets. He didn't come in with his usual clipboard or unreadable mask. Just a small, black-bound sketchbook. I thought maybe today, before the diagnostics, we could take a detour, he said. She blinked at him, still groggy from another restless night. A detour? He hesitated, then held up the sketchbook. Yesterday, you said you wanted to see the drawings I did as a kid. The ones I never showed anyone. I found the archive vault they were stored in. If you'd like, we could look. Together. Lyra sat up, surprised. He looked genuinely hopeful. Almost nervous. You remembered that? I don't forget useful data, he said softly. That made her smile. But by the time they reached the diagnostics wing, the warmth had already begun to fade. Cassiel greeted the staff with his usual precision. He held the door open as Lyra stepped inside. The lead technician was already prepping the monitors, pheromone trace mapping, neurological resonance scans, hormonal fluctuations. Cassiel lingered just outside the glass. Lyra climbed onto the cushioned exam table. Cold electrodes tapped against her skin as the sensors were applied. One to her temple, one to her sternum, one just below her navel. She winced at the chill. Can we make this fast? Only a few minutes, the tech said cheerfully. The machine hummed to life. It started with heat. Not nervousness. Not anticipation. Something wrong. Her skin began to prickle. Her pulse jumped. Then the sensor on her stomach beeped. Sharp. Repetitive. The tech's brow furrowed. Strange. On the monitor, her hormonal markers shot into the red. Pheromone levels surged. Her body temperature climbed by the second. That can't be right, the tech muttered. Cassiel, you might want to take a look. He was already moving. He hit the intercom. Shut it down. Now. We haven't finished the cycle. Shut it down. Too late. Lyra gasped. Her back arched off the table as a searing wave tore through her abdomen. Her vision blurred. Her lungs burned. A buzzing overtook her hearing. Then, scent. Metallic. Wild. Male. She choked on it. Felt it pump into the room. A foreign pheromone cocktail. Cassiel slammed his palm against the emergency override. The door hissed open. She collapsed into his arms. He caught her, cradling her like something fragile and sacred. His voice snapped through the chaos. What the hell did you do? It wasn't us, a nurse stammered. The trigger sequence was alpha level. My father forced a binding response, Cassiel growled, his voice low and lethal. Lyra clutched his shirt weakly, eyes glassy. I can't breathe. Prep the cryopod, he barked. Now. 10 minutes later, Lyra lay inside a recovery chamber. Cooling mist hissed around her. The worst of the pain had dulled, but every inch of her still ached. Till remembered. Cassiel stood at the window. She looked like she'd been broken open. He pulled out his phone. He knew what this meant. His father had made the move. To him, she was his 100% match to be secured and locked into a bloodline. His father didn't care what she felt. What he felt. He turned back to her. Her lips moved. A whisper. He leaned in. Ronan? Her hand dragged her phone across the side tray. Cassiel froze. She hit call. Ronan was mid-sprint on the training field when the voicemail came through. Lyra's voice, shaky, cracked, barely audible. Ronan, they did something, it hurts, please. The message ended. The phone dropped from his hand. Eli was at his side. What? We're going now. Gear up. Where? Ronan was already dialing. 2 minutes later, the Pack's SUVs were tearing down the highway. Destination, Vire Coven Research Center. Back at the lab. Cassiel stood outside the cryo chamber when the alert came through. Perimeter breach. Wildclaw Pack incoming. Vehicles approaching. High speed. He didn't flinch. He stepped closer to Lyra's pod. Kneeling. Her breathing had stabilized. Her color was returning. But her body still trembled. He brushed her knuckles. I didn't want this for you, he whispered. Any of it. The doors burst open. Ronan's boots hit the tile like thunder. He stormed into the lab, eyes blazing silver. Cassiel stood. Didn't block the path. Didn't say a word. Ronan stepped to the glass. Open it. Cassiel keyed in the override. Pod hissed. Ronan pulled off his hoodie, wrapped it around her, and scooped her into his arms. She whimpered once. Nuzzled into his chest. Cassiel watched. When Ronan turned to leave, Cassiel didn't stop him. Inside, the Wildclaw convoy was ready. Ronan climbed into the lead SUV, Lyra in his arms. Her breath shallow but steady. Eli glanced back. Where to? Ronan looked down at her. Her fingers curled weakly around his shirt. Home. She heard it. And for the first time since the pain started, she felt safe. The drive up the mountain was pure silence. Lyra lay curled against him in the back seat, wrapped in his hoodie, her skin fever-hot even through layers. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her fingers twitched against his chest like she was trapped in a dream. Every few minutes she whimpered small, broken sounds that twisted a knife in Ronan's gut. Eli didn't ask. He just drove faster. The Wildclaw's villa appeared through a shroud of snow and trees. Ronan carried her inside without a word, laid her gently on the bed, and stripped off his jacket, boots, gloves. Then the work began. Cold towels. Cooling pads. Stripping away her sweat-drenched clothes, replacing them with one of his soft t-shirts. He placed an ice pack at her spine and another at her wrists. Her skin sizzled beneath the cold. Still, her temperature didn't drop. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, she whimpered again. He ran to her side. She was thrashing lightly now, eyes fluttering beneath closed lids. Her skin was luminous with sweat, her breath too quick. She gripped the sheets like she was falling. Ronan, his name, said like a prayer. He froze. She reached for him blindly. Her fingers brushed his arm. Static danced across his skin. Help me, she gasped. Please. His jaw clenched. Lyra, you don't know what you're asking. But she did. She tugged him down. Her lips grazed his neck, her body pressing into his. She smelled like heat and fear and something only meant for him. He tried to pull back. He did. He made it all of 2 inches. Then she whispered, only you can stop it. And he snapped. The first time was raw. Brutal. Not unkind, but desperate. He pinned her to the mattress, his teeth marking every place his hands couldn't reach. Her cries were not of pain. She welcomed it, him, with a hunger that shook them both. She clawed at his shoulders, bit back his name, pulled him deeper. The second time he slowed, kissed the inside of her wrist, pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, I'm sorry. Her body arched into him anyway. The third time, she wrapped her legs around his waist and pulled him down like he was gravity. Her voice cracked on his name, and he lost himself again. By the fourth, she could barely speak. But it didn't stop. He needed her. Wanted her in a way that went beyond instinct, beyond fever. The need came from somewhere buried, something ancient, something that whispered mine every time her breath hitched under him. Hours passed. Outside, snow covered the windows. Inside, their bodies collided again and again. And again. It wasn't just mating. It was survival. A ritual. A vow carved in skin and sound and sweat. She whimpered. He soothed. She begged. He answered. She sobbed his name. And he gave her everything. At one point, he thought she'd passed out. He froze, his heart in his throat, only for her to stir, blink up at him, dazed and glowing. She whispered, don't stop. So he didn't. By dawn, she was asleep, laying in the crook of his arm, flushed and bruised, her neck a map of his mouth, her thighs littered with crescent-shaped marks. Her breathing had evened out. Her skin had cooled. For now. He brushed damp hair from her forehead. The wolf in him rumbled, satisfied. But the Ronan knew she'd burn again. And next time, she might not reach for him. Or worse, someone else might answer the call first. Still, he held her tighter. Buried his face in her hair. I'll find a way, he whispered. She stirred in her sleep, a soft sound escaping her throat, a whimper or a sigh, he couldn't tell. He stayed still, afraid even breathing too loud might wake her. Then slowly, his hand moved down to where her pulse beat steadily at her waist. Warm. Alive. Still his. And yet she wasn't bound to him. Not truly. Cassiel's scent was still in her blood, still tangled with hers. Ronan's jaw clenched. He kissed the curve of her neck again. The wind eased. And Ronan Thorn, heir to the Wildclaw Pack, stayed awake beside the girl who had ruined him completely. The next day, Lyra curled into herself at the bottom of the tub, knees drawn to her chest. Steam curled around her limbs in thin, ghostly wisps, but none of it could reach the fire still burning beneath her skin. Her fingers were pruned. Her lips dry. Her breathing shallow and fast. She tried again. Nothing. Her hand shook with frustration. She was raw, trembling, too sensitive and not sensitive enough all at once. Her own touch did nothing. Not anymore. Not since the mark. Not without the scent, his scent. An Alpha's. Tears burned behind her eyes as she stared at the fogged mirror. She wiped a circle clear, and what stared back at her was a stranger. Cheeks flushed, pupils wide, lips parted in silent desperation. She hated what she saw. A girl no longer in control of her own body. A body that demanded something it couldn't create for itself anymore. A body changed. "What have they done to me?" she whispered. And somewhere deep inside her, a worse thought followed. What if this is just what I am now? Ronan left before dawn. He kissed her temple, promised to be back before sunset. He was heading back to the Wildclaw estate to ask help from the best healer their pack, someone who could possibly undo the damage burning her alive from the inside out. The Vire Coven's elite moved like shadows. Silent. Efficient. Merciless. She didn't even hear them until the dart kissed her neck. Her limbs went heavy before she hit the floor. "Target secured," someone said. Cassiel stood in silence before the floor-to-ceiling windows of the council chamber. Snow fell softly outside, blurring the outlines of the garden beyond. The door opened behind him. "She's been retrieved." His breath caught. On whose authority? Alpha himself. He was gone before the door closed. She didn't speak to him for the first 2 days. Private quarters were sterile, elegant, lifeless. Food arrived untouched. The windows didn't open. The bed was too soft. Her body betrayed her every night. Writhing. Trembling. Searing with a heat that no cold shower or breathless prayer could ease. And every night he came. He didn't say much, like a shadow carved from guilt and shame. The third night, she broke. "Stop staring at me like that," she snapped, voice cracked and wet. "You think this helps?" Cassiel knelt beside the bed. "I think you are in pain." "No shit." Her body arched again. A groan spilled from her throat before she could swallow it. She turned her face into the pillow. "I hate this," she whispered. "I hate you." "I know." Another pause. Her fists curled in the sheets. Her legs trembled. "Do you want me to leave?" She didn't answer. Slowly, carefully, he reached for her. Not with the assumption of permission, but with the hesitation of someone expecting rejection. His touch was featherlight. Reverent. She shuddered under it. When he pressed his lips to her shoulder, she let out a sob. It was not romantic. Not sweet. It was desperate. Shameful. Necessary. He whispered apologies into her skin. Every kiss a confession, every breath a plea. "I'm sorry," he murmured again and again, voice fraying at the edges. "I'm sorry they did this to you. I'm sorry this is the only way I know how to help." And somehow her body responded. Not to pleasure, but to surrender. To the terrible, aching need for release. When it was over, she turned her face away, tears drying on her cheeks. Her voice was raw. "I'm not your legacy incubator. I know. I'm not your bonded project. I know." He pulled the blankets up, hands gentle. She didn't thank him. But she didn't push him away either. Each night after that followed the same cruel rhythm. Her body broke. He came. He stayed. He whispered apologies and gave her what little comfort he could offer, what her biology demanded and her heart despised. And somewhere between those nights, something inside him cracked open. The bloodline. The future he was supposed to want. It all began to feel hollow. One night, as the storm howled outside and the fire burned low, Lyra lay curled on her side, slick with sweat, trembling and silent. Cassiel sat beside the bed. Took her hand, trembling as much as hers. "If I have to break you," he said, voice cracking, "just to prove I'm worthy of a crown, then I don't want it." She blinked, lips parting. He leaned forward, pressed a kiss to her brow. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For all of it." Preparations for the wedding moved like clockwork. Silver banners. Polished armor. Silent corridors. Cassiel stood before the mirror, attendants fussing with his collar. He looked perfect. Impeccable. Empty. Across the compound, Lyra stood by her window, pale fingers pressed to the glass. Her reflection was a ghost. Her eyes gleamed with something feral. Far beyond the forest, Ronan crouched in the undergrowth, his nose to the dirt, catching the scent he'd been hunting for days. Vire Coven. He rose, eyes glowing. They're not keeping her. The hall gleamed like a blade. The high windows of the Vire Coven ceremonial chamber glowed silver in the moonlight. Silk banners lined the aisle. Everything was symmetrical. Perfect. Lifeless. Cassiel stood in front of the mirror in full regalia, dark collar, ceremonial blade strapped to his side, crest of the Vire Coven etched across his chest. He looked like a prince. He felt like a traitor. Each layer of fabric on his skin felt like a shackle. Every breath he took tasted like ash. She cried again last night. That thought had followed him like a ghost through every fitting, every vow rehearsal, every ritual briefing. Lyra, curled on the bed she didn't choose, shaking in pain, biting her lip until it bled just to keep from screaming. And he had knelt there again, offering himself like penance. Apologizing with his hands, with his mouth, with his silence. And now they expected him to stand at an altar and pretend none of it mattered. It mattered. Mattered more than anything. Lyra sat in the preparation chamber, draped in silver and ivory, the fabric heavy like mourning robes. Her hair had been braided, her wrists adorned with soft golden chains, each loop a symbol of unity. She stared at her reflection. She looked like a bride. She felt like a prisoner. No guard spoke to her. No one met her eyes. She'd stopped fighting the staff's instructions hours ago. Not because she'd accepted anything, but because the numbness had finally reached her bones. When the door creaked open, she didn't turn. Not until she heard his voice. "Lyra." She spun. Her heart stopped. "Cassiel." He stepped inside quickly, closing the door behind him, eyes scanning the corners of the room before locking on her. "I'm getting you out now." She blinked, stunned. Her voice came out hoarse. "What?" "There's no time to explain, but I've arranged a back passage through the north corridor. 1 guard rotation, 20 seconds a blind spot." Her throat tightened. "Then let's go." They slipped into the shadows between ceremonial wings, Lyra lifting her skirts, Cassiel moving with precise, measured urgency. His blade stayed sheathed for now. But the alarm came sooner than expected. A silver glyph above the corridor lit red. A shout. "Boots." Cassiel swore under his breath, shoving Lyra behind a pillar. "Plan B," he muttered, pulling the blade free. 3 elite guards rounded the bend, glaives drawn. Cassiel didn't hesitate. He moved like a creature unshackled, elegant, ruthless, unrelenting. 1 guard went down with a slice across the thigh, the second blocked, but not fast enough. Blood sprayed against the marble. "Go," he shouted over his shoulder. "Now, Lyra." She ran. But only a few steps. A 4th guard appeared from the side corridor, steel aimed straight for her chest. Cassiel lunged. "Stale met flèche." His shoulder caught the blade's edge, sharp, silver-lined. He stumbled, gritting his teeth, crimson soaking into his pristine jacket. "No!" Lyra turned back, eyes wide, panic rising. "You're hurt." He grabbed her arm with his uninjured hand, forcing her toward the exit. "You have to go. Don't stop. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. You have to." His voice cracked. "If they catch you now, it's over." Run, Lyra. Run. A howl echoed down the corridor. Not human. The window beside them exploded inward. A dark shape crashed through, hulking, fast, unmistakable. Ronan. He landed in full shift, half wolf, half man, fangs bared, eyes glowing like molten silver. One swing of his claws sent the last standing guard crashing into the wall. Before Lyra could speak, he was grabbing her waist with one arm, yanking Cassiel up with the other. Time's up. Move. They bolted into the night. Through servant tunnels, down gravel paths slick with moonlight, across the forest's edge where Ronan's car waited. He threw Cassiel onto the back seat, blood still leaking from his shoulder, then pulled Lyra onto the front. The engine roared to life. Cassiel looked once at the place that made him, then whispered, barely audible, "From this night on, I'm not theirs anymore." Next, the moonlight poured through the gauzy curtains, casting pale silver across the bedroom floor. Lyra stirred beneath the thin sheets, her skin still flushed from the fever that had finally broken. Past 3 nights had blurred into a fog of instinct, heat, and surrender, a spiral of touches, sweat, and breathless gasps she could barely differentiate from dreams. But now everything was quiet. Her eyes opened slowly. Cassiel sat in the armchair beside the bed, long legs folded, reading glasses low on his nose as he skimmed a dusty book on lichen mating biology. Ronan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, gaze distant but sharp, like a sentinel carved from shadow. They looked tired. And very, very real. Lyra pushed herself up. Her body ached in a dull, post-fever way, not from sickness but from too much sensation, too much everything. Her fingers curled around the sheet. "So?" Her voice cracked. "What now?" Cassiel looked up. Ronan moved first, crossing to the bed. "You tell us." She blinked. "I don't know." "Then let me guess," Ronan said, voice low. "You're wondering which one of us you belong to." Cassiel's gaze sharpened. "That's not fair." Ronan didn't flinch. "No, what's not fair is pretending this is sustainable." Lyra's heart pounded. "I'm not a prize to be split." "Then don't make us fight for you," Ronan said tightly. "Maybe you should stop assuming I'd let either of you claim me," she snapped. Cassiel closed the book. Slowly. "You think this is easy for me?" Lyra whispered. 3 nights of not knowing who I am anymore. Of needing you both so badly it made me sick. And now you're asking me to choose?" Ronan looked away. Cassiel rose to his feet, walked over, and sat on the edge of the bed. "No one's asking you to choose," he said gently. "We're asking what you want." Lyra stared between them. These 2 powerful, proud men. One born to rule, the other to protect. Both had touched parts of her she hadn't known existed. Both had seen her unravel. Neither had walked away. Her voice broke. "I want you both. But not like animals fighting over meat. Not because the bond demands it. Because I choose it." Cassiel exhaled slowly. "Then we choose you." Ronan came closer. Sat beside her other side. "But this isn't going to be easy," he murmured. "Nothing about this has been easy," she replied, smiling through tears. They sat together in silence, the 3 of them tangled not in bodies but in something far harder to undo. That night, it wasn't fever that drove them together. It was warmth. They didn't rush. They didn't burn. Cassiel kissed her fingers, Ronan kissed her spine. They held her like something precious, not something broken. And when she whispered their names into the dark, neither one pulled away. They slept tangled together in the sheets, breath sinking in rhythm, limbs overlapping like roots of the same tree. The morning sun filtered through the trees lining the main walkway of Hawthorne University, casting long, golden shadows across the campus. Students hurried between dorms and lecture halls, clutching coffee cups and dragging overstuffed suitcases behind them. A new semester had begun, loud, alive, and for some, oddly comforting. Lyra adjusted the strap of her backpack as she walked toward the medical school building. She didn't have to look around to know people were watching her. They weren't exactly staring, but she could feel the glances, the whispers, the subtle double takes. She knew the signs by now. Cassiel walked on her right, dressed in a black shirt and gray wool coat. His face was unreadable as always, but he kept close. Ronan was just behind them, one hand in his pocket, the other holding his hockey gear. He was alert, watching the crowd, always a step behind but never far from her. "They're trying to figure out what's going on with the three of us," Lyra murmured. Ronan gave a low grunt. "Didn't deny it," Cassiel said flatly. "They don't matter." Lyra didn't answer. That afternoon, the university hosted a short welcome ceremony for exchange students in the main auditorium. When the program director read out the final name, he paused deliberately. Evelina Hall from the Vire Coven Institute. Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Lyra glanced toward the stage. A blonde girl stepped into view, dressed in a crisp designer blazer and a tailored skirt that ended just above the knee. Her posture was perfect. Her steps graceful. Her smile flawless. "Her dad's the beta of Vire Coven," Ronan murmured behind her. Lyra frowned. Cassiel didn't say a word. His eyes were fixed on the stage, cold and unblinking. After the ceremony, Evelina approached them through the dispersing crowd, gaze locked on Cassiel like a heat-seeking missile. "Cass," she said sweetly. "It's been a while." Cassiel didn't blink. "Why are you here?" She smiled. "The Alpha requested the transfer himself." "I was surprised too." Lyra stood quietly beside Cassiel, her fingers tightening around her bag strap. Something about Evelina felt off, like a perfectly wrapped gift box that rattled when you shook it. Then Evelina turned to her, still smiling. "You must be Lyra. I've heard so much about you. You're even more authentic than I imagined." Cassiel cut in, voice sharp. "Don't call me Cass. I don't like it." Evelina paused, then gave a softer smile. "Of course, Cassiel." She turned and walked off, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Lyra watched her go. "So, what is she here for?" Cassiel didn't hesitate. "To marry me." That night, Lyra sat in the med building's resource room, staring blankly at the new rotation schedule. Cassiel leaned against the wall behind her. "She and I were confirmed as 99% matched through the system. But I never agreed to it." Lyra didn't turn. "She's kinda perfect." Cassiel didn't even blink. "I don't want perfect." She spun around and looked at him, eyes sharp. "Then what do you want?" His gaze held hers. "You." Her throat tightened. She laughed, a little breathlessly. "You're really bad at being romantic, you know that?" He leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You don't need me to be romantic. You just need to know I'm not choosing anyone else." Hawthorne's gossip cycle didn't just turn, it accelerated. Evelina wasn't just another pretty face. She was smart, refined, and carried herself like she belonged at the center of a legacy. By the end of her first week, campus had practically crowned her the new queen. Through all, she was a 99% system match for Cassiel Vale. Lyra? She was the 100% match. The system had confirmed it. But she was also human. And that's what everyone couldn't stop whispering about. By midweek, the student forum had exploded. How does a species-incompatible match even work biologically? Evelina is the obvious choice. Trained. Proven. Pure blood. Lyra didn't need to read it. She could feel it in the stairs. Even in the library. Even walking to the lab. "Hey," Evelina said, catching up to her near the student greenhouse. "You've had a rough few days." "I just wanted to check in." Lyra looked up warily. "You don't have to." Evelina smiled, voice low and silky. "You know, I used to wonder what kind of girl could match Cassiel perfectly. And now I see maybe the system makes mistakes sometimes." "What's your point?" "My point is, Cassiel's meant to lead. Vire Coven doesn't just need a match, it needs a partner. That's not about romance, Lyra. It's about survival." She hesitated, as if choosing the kindest possible words. Lyra's spine went rigid. Evelina stepped back, still smiling. "If your lifespan doesn't match his, it would be a big problem." Cassiel found Lyra in the med library, curled over a pile of notes she wasn't reading. She didn't look up. "I know I'm the system match. I know. But I also know they're all wondering what kind of glitch lets a human match a pure-blood alpha heir." He sat beside her. "You're not a glitch." She finally looked at him. You don't know that. He met her eyes. You are the most precise match to me. That pulled a weak laugh from her. That was almost poetic. He leaned closer. I'll do better next time. Campus wasn't quiet anymore, with clipped smiles and long stares as Lyra walked by. All she could hear was her own name. And Evelina's. In the common lounge, someone had projected the new campus promo video onto the main screen. Lyra paused. Evelina stood framed in the shot, smiling in soft morning light outside the med building. Our generation will redefine what compatibility means, she said smoothly. We're not just looking at numbers, but at sustainability. Long-term partnership. She didn't say Lyra's name. She didn't have to. You okay? Ronan asked later, tossing his gym bag into a locker. Lyra didn't answer. Her fingers were clenched around her notebook, knuckles white. He followed her eyes. Oh, for he slammed the locker shut. How was she still walking around here without someone calling her out? Lyra exhaled slowly. Because she's not wrong. Ronan stiffened. Don't start believing the crap she's planting. Later that afternoon, Ronan caught Evelina at the edge of the rink. Stay away from her, he said without a hint of pretense. Evelina blinked, then laughed. I'm not doing anything. Just being friendly. Ronan stepped forward. If you push her again, I don't care who your father is. I'll push back harder. Evelina didn't flinch, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she walked away. Later that night, on the dorm rooftop, the three of them sat in rare silence. Lyra looked out across the field lights blinking in the distance. They're right, she murmured. I'm human. I can't shift. I don't heal like you. I'll get old faster. Slower. I'll be weak long before either of you show signs of aging. Cassiel shifted beside her. That's not how I see time. Ronan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're not a weakness, Lyra. You're the whole damn point. She looked between them, heart thudding. I'm scared, she whispered. Cassiel nodded. But we're here. With you. No matter what comes. The encrypted call came through just past midnight. Cassiel stepped out of the dorm quietly, boots crunching over gravel as he made his way to the old library's back garden. The holographic screen flickered to life. His mother's face appeared, pale and drawn. Cassiel, she breathed, eyes red. I had to route this through 3 proxies. Your dad doesn't know I'm contacting you. Mom, tell me. There was a long pause. Then, your dad's dying. The words struck harder than he expected. He's kept it quiet. Only a few of us know. Cancer's spread. The doctors said weeks, maybe months. Cassiel looked away, jaw clenched. That's why he tried to force the bond with Lyra. His mother nodded. He wanted to see the next generation secured before he passed. A system match with perfect genetics. He thought if you just gave in, the rest would fall into place. I'm not a breeder, Cassiel said coldly. I know, she whispered. But now he's desperate. If you don't act, the elders will hand over succession rights to the cousin clans. Vire Coven will be gutted. I already gave up the title. I know. But Evelina is still compatible. If you won't bring Lyra, at least bring someone. He was silent for a long moment. Then, Lyra is not something I bring. She's someone I protect. Unbeknownst to either of them, a shadow lingered just around the corner of the stone wall, Evelina. She hadn't meant to follow him. But now she stood frozen, the full weight of the conversation sinking in. Cassiel's father was dying. And if she could take Lyra's place, she might become Luna of the most powerful bloodline soon. The next day was unusually warm. Lyra sat beneath the med building's overhang, flipping through training notes, though her eyes weren't really reading. Tea. Evelina's voice was soft as she handed over a paper cup. Red date and ginger. It calms the nerves. Lyra didn't take it. Evelina sat anyway, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. You've held up well. Honestly, I didn't expect you to last this long. Lyra stayed silent. Evelina tilted her head. You know, Cassiel gave up everything for you. His name. His rank. even his inheritance. Lyra's fingers curled around her pen. And now you have Ronan too. Isn't that enough? Lyra's eyes didn't move. Why keep holding on to Cassiel? Let him go. Let him return to his people. His family needs him. His father is dying. That got her. Lyra's gaze jerked up. What did you say? Evelina gave her a soft, pitying smile. You didn't know? Oh, I thought he would have told you. She stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. You're human, Lyra. You don't heal fast. You don't live long. You can't lead a pack. Why make him carry that burden too? Cassiel found Lyra in the greenhouse that evening, sitting alone among the steam and vines. You're quiet, he said. She didn't look up. Why didn't you tell me? His chest tightened. You know, your father's dying. Evelina told me. He swore under his breath. What? Why hide it? He stepped closer. You are not a bargaining chip for their legacy. Her voice cracked. Then what am I, Cassiel? He reached for her hand. You're the only future I want. Evelina knew time was running out. She wasn't supposed to be back at the research center this weekend. No one noticed her slip into the restricted biochemical vault. Her hand trembled as she retrieved the vial. It was still in early-stage testing. A genetic recalibration compounds. Evelina stared at the vial, pale gold with a shimmer of violet. This is for the greater good, she whispered to herself. Sunday afternoon, the medical building was unusually quiet. Most students were off campus or catching up on sleep. Corridors echoed with nothing but the occasional footsteps and the hum of fluorescent lights. In the back of the anatomy wing, the student locker room stood empty, except for one changing stall. Lyra had just finished a supplemental anatomy workshop. Her shoulders ached from hours of posture over lab counters. She moved slowly, rubbing the back of her neck as she entered the locker area, half-lidded eyes blinking away fatigue. She set down her bag, peeled off her lab coat, and turned to open her locker, humming faintly under her breath. She didn't hear the door open. Didn't sense the whisper of rubber-soled shoes moving across tile. Didn't notice the subtle hiss of a pressurized injector being activated. All she felt was a quick, cold sting at the base of her neck. She flinched, hand flying up to the spot. What the? She murmured, rubbing the area. Tingled for a second. Static? A bug bite? She glanced around. No one. The door behind her creaked softly, closing on its own, she assumed. Lyra shrugged it off. She was too tired to question anything. She pulled on her hoodie, stuffed her coat into her bag, and headed out into the pale afternoon light. Behind her, one stall door remained ajar. That evening, a post went live on the campus forum. Case study: rare human alpha match observed under unverified conditions. While system-detected compatibility is generally accurate, biological feedback loops can create divergence over time, especially when the species baseline is non-shifter. Perhaps a follow-up test is warranted. Post was quickly upvoted. Within 3 hours, it had over 300 comments. By morning, it would be trending across every pack-affiliated student thread. But Lyra never saw the post. By midnight, she was too busy trying not to collapse. It started as a slow burn behind her eyes. Then came the dizziness. Her hands trembled. Her legs felt like lead. She barely made it up the stairs to her dorm. She dropped her bag in the hallway. Couldn't remember if she locked the door. Her skin was hot, fever-hot, burning from the inside out. She stumbled into bed fully clothed, curling into herself, trying to breathe through the waves of nausea and heat. The air felt thick. Her thoughts blurred. The sheets twisted around her limbs as her muscles spasmed. Her heart was racing, so loud she could hear it in her ears. She clutched her pillow like it was the only solid thing left in the world. And somewhere in that chaos, just before the world tipped completely sideways, she thought she heard a voice. Not outside. Inside. Cassiel was the first to sense something was wrong. Within minutes, he was pounding on her dorm door. No response. The scent of heat and sickness hit him as soon as he forced it open. Shit, he muttered, rushing inside. Lyra lay curled on the bed, drenched in sweat, cheeks flushed red, lips parted as she gasped for breath. Her hoodie was soaked through, clinging to her skin like a second layer. She was shivering and burning at the same time. He pulled off his jacket, knelt beside her, and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. It was scalding. Ronan arrived seconds later, expression thunderous. "I smelled it from the stairs," he said, already pulling the window open to let air in. "What happened to her?" "I don't know," Cassiel said, voice tight. "But she's not stabilizing." They worked in tandem without needing to speak. Ronan grabbed a cold compress and bottled water. Cassiel removed Lyra's soaked hoodie, replaced it with one of his own shirts. She moaned faintly at the change in temperature, but didn't wake. "Her pulse is spiking again." Cassiel sat beside her, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders, murmuring close to her ear. "You're okay. We've got you." Ronan settled on her other side, stretching a blanket across her lower body, then pressed 2 fingers lightly to the inside of her wrist. "It's like her body's fighting something. Hard. She's burning up from the inside." Hours passed. Neither of them left. Cassiel kept her anchored with calm, rhythmic breathing. Ronan rotated the compresses. They kept her between them like a shield wall against whatever storm she was caught in. Just before dawn, Lyra's breathing slowed. Her fingers twitched. And somewhere behind her eyes, the darkness cracked. Something was waking. Around 6 a.m., Ronan stepped into the hallway for air and to call one of his teammates for help with supplies. His phone buzzed just as he was hanging up. A message from one of the newer forwards on the ice team. "Hey, Captain, you see the campus forum last night? Pretty big thread about Lyra. Might want to check it out." Ronan's brows knitted. He opened the thread, read in silence for a full minute, and then walked back into the room, jaw clenched. He tossed the phone onto Cassiel's lap. Cassiel scrolled, reading quickly. Then again. Slower. They locked eyes. "This dropped the same night she collapsed," Ronan said, voice low. "Too precise to be coincidence," Cassiel muttered. "She was fine until yesterday." Ronan crossed his arms. "So either someone knew she was going to destabilize or they made it happen." Silence stretched between them. The scent of steam and fever hung in the room. Lyra shifted slightly in the bed, letting out a soft sound. Cassiel's gaze returned to her. "We need to find out who did this." Light filtered softly through the dorm curtains, casting long lines across the floor. Lyra stirred. Cassiel sat up instantly, eyes locked on her face. Her lashes fluttered. Her breathing shifted. And then she opened her eyes. "Cassiel," she rasped. He leaned in, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "I'm here." She turned her head slowly. "Ronan." He stood at the foot of the bed, arms crossed, eyes unreadable but soft. "You scared the hell out of us." Lyra tried to smile but winced. "Water." Cassiel already had a cup in hand. He helped her sit up just enough to sip. "Better." "A little." She looked between them, blinking slowly. "What happened to me?" The 2 men exchanged a glance, but before either could speak, Cassiel's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then froze. "I have to take this," he said quietly, rising to step into the hall. 2 minutes later, Cassiel came back in. His face was pale. Tight. Lyra's gaze sharpened. "Who was it?" He opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at Ronan. She narrowed her eyes. Don't you dare keep something from me again." Cassiel exhaled. "It was my father." She sat up straighter. "What did he want?" Cassiel's voice dropped. "He said he doesn't have much time. He wants me to bring you back to the research center," Cassiel continued. "To retest the match. Officially." Lyra's throat tightened. "He doesn't believe I'm a true match?" "He says if the results show it's not 100%, he'll let you go. No more interference." Lyra didn't speak for a moment. Then she looked at Ronan. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "That's not all. There's something else." Cassiel winced. "We were going to wait until you were stronger." Lyra crossed her arms. "Tell me." Ronan grabbed his phone and passed it to her. She scrolled through the forum thread. Her fingers trembled. They think I'm a mistake. They're trying to make people doubt the system, Ronan said. Or doubt you. She looked up slowly. Did your father see this? Cassiel nodded. Probably. He didn't say it outright, but the timing, he called less than 8 hours after this thread went viral. Lyra's lips parted. So, they think if they break me down enough, I'll walk away. She sat in silence, gaze distant. Then she closed her eyes. The bond between them, soft, barely there, shimmered. Cassiel felt it first. A warmth pressing gently against his mind. Then Ronan. Can you both hear me? Their eyes widened. Lyra opened her eyes. They were glassy but calm. I met her, she said aloud. My wolf. Cassiel froze. What? She was inside me this whole time. Waiting. Ronan stepped closer. You're saying you're not human, she whispered. Not exactly. I think I never was. Just late to wake up. Silence again. Then Cassiel moved to sit beside her. Lyra, you don't have to go through the match test. You don't owe them anything. I know, she said softly. She looked at him then, truly looked. But I owe it to myself. I won't live with everyone whispering that I'm a fluke. I won't let them call me a glitch. Ronan crouched in front of her. We'll go with you. She gave a small smile. I know. Cassiel pressed his forehead to hers. No matter what the results say, you're mine. You were before the system said so, and you will be after. Her eyes shimmered. I'm not leaving you. I just want this clean. They both nodded. The matching chamber was colder than Lyra thought. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, reflecting off the sterile white walls of the Vire Coven Research Center. Cassiel stood beside her, quiet and steady, while Ronan leaned against the far wall with arms crossed and eyes scanning every technician in the room. Behind the observation glass, a small audience had gathered. Doctors, technicians, elders, and Evelina, front row of course, her cream-colored suit crisp, her expression politely unreadable. Lyra knew why she was here. Evelina hadn't come for science. She'd come for spectacle. Procedure began with a baseline resonance scan. Lyra was guided into a reclining diagnostic chair, a halo of sensors descending slowly to read her mental and genetic frequencies. On the other side, Cassiel sat in a mirrored chair, palms open, a thin stream of bioneural threads connecting the two. Technicians muttered quietly. Adjustments were made. Screens blinked. Readouts updated in real time. Then, the resonance stabilized. Strong. Clean. Unshakable. Technician closest to the console leaned in, blinking in disbelief. Alpha bond 100%, he said. No signal drift. No mismatch error. Perfect sync. A beat of stunned silence passed. Then murmurs rippled through the room. From the viewing area, Evelina's fingers tightened around her silk clutch. Ronan arched an eyebrow. That's awkward. Cassiel allowed himself the smallest smile. The system continued. Additional readings confirmed Lyra's genetic awakening, a medical class werewolf designation, previously dormant, now stabilized. Her neural signature was flagged as a rare empathic sync type, capable of influencing and harmonizing alpha stress. Evelina took a single step back from the glass. Then Ronan's comm buzzed. He checked the encrypted message, then slipped out without a word. 2 minutes later, he returned, with a tablet in hand and a grim look on his face. Cassiel, he murmured. It's time. Cassiel nodded. He stepped to the side, took the tablet, and cast the main screen to the room. Since we're confirming truths today, he said calmly, let's not leave any out. A recovered security feed played across the wall. First, a time-stamped clip from the biochemical vault, Evelina entering after hours using a copied clearance card. Then, grainy hallway footage of her near the anatomy wing at the exact time Lyra had been injected. Gasps echoed. Lyra stared numb. Cassiel's voice was ice. We recovered deleted access logs and overwritten camera feeds. Everything you just saw was removed from the system manually. Evelina paled. This isn't what it looks like. It looks like biochemical assault, Ronan said. On a Luna candidate. Guards entered the room. Evelina, one of the guards said, voice sharp and flat. You're under arrest for violating genetic security, tampering with system match integrity, and unauthorized biochemical interference. Her eyes jumped from one guard to the other. I was protecting the future. No, Cassiel cut in, voice like stone. You were trying to rewrite it. They all watched as she was escorted out. Then came the real storm. Cassiel's father entered from the north door, two aides flanking him like shadows. He looked older than the last time he'd been seen in public, thinner, shoulders hunched, skin pale and drawn. He looked at Lyra for a long moment. And then he smiled. She is everything the system said she was, he murmured. No wonder she survived. Then he turned to Cassiel. You'll mark her officially within the week, he said, and begin the transition to alpha leadership. I won't last another season. Cassiel's jaw clenched. Father. But Lyra stepped forward. Wait, she said gently but firmly. The alpha looked at her, surprised. I might be able to help, she said. To heal you. It's part of what I am. The room shifted again. Elders sat up straighter. The aides froze in place. Cassiel's father narrowed his eyes. You're saying you can fix what the best doctors couldn't? Lyra didn't even blink. I can try. She stepped closer and raised a hand. A soft pulse of energy flowed outward, gentle, warm, steady. The old man flinched at first, then straightened. His chest expanded with a deeper breath. A little color returned to his face. He stared at her. And what do you want in return? Lyra's eyes flicked to Cassiel. Then back. He's still your heir, she said. But if I help you live, really live, not just survive, then he deserves a choice. Not a sentence. Let him decide when he's ready to lead. Not because time's running out, but because he chooses it. The old man stared at her for a long, silent moment. Then finally, he nodded. Deal. Cassiel looked at her like she'd just pulled stars out of the sky and handed them to him. Ronan let out a low whistle. Remind me to never play poker with you. Lyra gave a tired little laugh. I'm not bluffing. 2 weeks later, life on campus had finally started to breathe again. The rumors died down. The forums went quiet. And the whispers that once followed Lyra like a shadow down every hallway had turned into small nods, hesitant smiles, and shy, mumbled apologies. Hey, a girl from her med theory class said one afternoon, fidgeting in the courtyard. I said some stuff before. About the matching. And I was wrong. I'm sorry. Lyra blinked, then gave her a gentle smile. It's okay. You didn't know. After that, more came forward. Classmates who once stared or muttered behind her back now stopped her just to say hi, or held doors open with a quiet, Hey, Lyra. She didn't hold it against them anymore. 'Cause everything had changed. The university headmaster held a formal press conference that Friday. He was flanked by two very serious-looking alpha heirs. Ronan, wearing his Hawthorne Ice Team jacket. Cassiel, clean-cut in a black blazer, the kind that made him look more prince than predator. They stood in front of the student body and read out the official investigation statement. Evelina had been charged and sentenced for interference with a system-matched bond candidate, tampering with controlled biochemical substances, and manipulating public discourse with malicious intent. Campus buzzed for days after. But this time, it wasn't about Lyra. It was about justice. Lyra returned to her position as a student medical assistant, but now things were different. Her once-long hours sorting supplies or running simulations were suddenly more efficient. Her touch could stabilize patients with low-shift fevers. Her presence in post-op recovery wings was met with quiet gratitude from shifter students who couldn't articulate why, only that they felt better near her. Dr. Menon gave her a rare approving nod. Keep your energy steady, Ren. You're starting to glow. She chuckled. It's just wolf stuff. But it wasn't just her work that shifted. Cassiel's father had agreed to let his son remain at school and to let himself be treated. Lyra visited the Vire Research Center twice a week. Each time, she placed her hands over the man's chest and sent calm, restorative waves through his body. His color improved. His pain dulled. Then, to the surprise of even the senior physicians, his tumor began to shrink. More surprising than the healing, though, was the quiet transformation that followed. One afternoon, as Cassiel waited outside the treatment room, he heard laughter. Real, deep-bellied laughter. His father. Inside, the once cold man leaned back in his chair, glancing fondly at his Luna, who stood beside him. "These kids," he muttered, shaking his head. "We're not retiring, love. We've got another 40 years in us at least." His Luna grinned. "Speak for yourself. I'm only doing this if I get a spa day every full moon." Cassiel's mother met Lyra at the door that day. Her smile was soft and warm. "Thank you," she said, voice thick with meaning. "You didn't just save my mate. You gave us our son back." Lyra's heart caught in her throat. Cassiel continued his coursework but also joined the campus art collective. He began painting again, something he hadn't done since he was 12. His first canvas? A moonlit forest with 3 silhouettes, a girl, a silver wolf, and 2 alphas standing guard. Ronan, back in captain mode, led the ice team through 2 back-to-back wins. He grinned more, yelled less, and started assigning team therapy sessions like it was no big deal. "Emotions aren't weakness," he muttered when asked. "They're just maintenance." Everyone blamed Lyra. She didn't deny it. One evening, the 3 of them sat on the rooftop again. Lyra leaned against Cassiel's shoulder, her feet in Ronan's lap, a container of snacks between them. "We okay?" she asked softly. Cassiel kissed her temple. "More than okay." Ronan popped a berry into his mouth. "This is suspiciously domestic." Lyra laughed. "Shut up and pass the chocolate." And for the first time, none of them were waiting for the other shoe to drop. The war might not be over. But this moment? This was peace. Next. Hot bonus story 1, Between Ink and Moonlight. It was late. The only light in the studio came from a warm amber lamp in the corner, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor, and over the girl sitting quietly by the easel. Lyra wore a loose gray-blue sweater, a piece of linen draped across her knees. Her back was straight, hair loosely tied up, exposing the elegant line of her neck and the delicate curve of her shoulder blades. Cassiel stood across from her, palette knife in hand, so focused he looked as if she were the only landscape he'd ever wanted to paint. "You really want to paint me like this?" Her voice was low, a little shy, with a teasing lilt. "I'm not painting you," Cassiel murmured, eyes fixed on her. "I'm painting the marks I've left on your body." Lyra's cheeks flushed. Just as she opened her mouth to retort, the studio door clicked open behind her. "I knew you two were up to something." Ronan's voice came with a smirk and the lingering scent of post-training pheromones. He still wore his ice hockey team jacket, hair damp like he'd just stepped out of the shower. "You didn't say you were coming back," Lyra huffed. Ronan stepped behind her, leaning in to rest one hand on her shoulder. "Sitting like that, you're practically inviting us to do more." She inhaled sharply, turning even redder. Cassiel dragged out the last stroke of paint, set his knife down, and walked over to untie her hair. "You're teaming up to bully me?" she mumbled, though she didn't pull away. "Not bullying," Cassiel whispered against her lips. "Worship." Ronan locked the door. Moonlight spilled in through the window, casting silver on the night about to unravel. She sat on the stool, sandwiched between 2 alpha heirs. Clothes were peeled away inch by inch. The palette knife clattered to the floor and paint smudged against her skin, trails their fingers followed. She trembled, breathless, her moans swallowed by kisses. Her legs were lifted and held, her senses surrendered. Cassiel dipped his finger in a smudge of blue-gray and traced it over her collarbone. "Now this is real inspiration." Panting, eyes glassy with tears, she whispered, "You ruined your painting." Ronan grinned at her ear. "Nah. We just printed the original." Paint and breath tangled. She was completely undone between them. The unfinished canvas was later locked in Cassiel's drawer. Titled Only Ours. Next. Hot bonus story 2, Under Coach's Orders. The ice arena was humid and cold at the same time. After practice, Ronan stripped off his gear, sweat clinging to his tank. A single line of sweat traced down his neck. He wiped his face and reached for his locker when footsteps echoed in the hall. Lyra peeked through the door, holding a bag of warm drinks, Cassiel beside her. We came to get you. Ronan raised a brow. This isn't a pickup. It's an ambush. Cassiel laughed, closing the door behind them. She wanted to see if you've improved. Improved? Ronan snorted. I can lift her with one hand now. Before Lyra could retort, click. The door lock engaged. She turned. What was that? Cassiel shrugged. Broken door. Maintenance said no one's using this room tonight. Locked for now. The air grew heavy. The hockey locker room was small, packed with gear and lingering sweat. Ronan's pheromones hadn't faded yet. They wrapped around her like heat waves. She swallowed and set down the drinks. We'll just wait for it to be fixed. You can open something else right now, Ronan said, voice lazy, walking toward her. Cassiel slid in behind her, hand on her waist, whispering, Let's test how long you can last without moaning. Lyra blinked. Are you hockey players or a pervert club? We're your team, Cassiel replied. Ronan pressed her onto the backup gear cabinet, cold metal biting into her thighs. Her heart stuttered. She opened her mouth, but Cassiel silenced her with a kiss. The room wasn't big, but it had one mirrored wall. In it, she saw herself between two men. Ronan's strong frame behind her. Cassiel's tender gaze in front. Hooks on the racks swayed. A water bottle clattered. Training mats were pulled beneath her. They were precise. And wild. Her last attempt to resist shattered when Ronan whispered in her ear, Listen, assistant. This is a live simulation. Learn how to study your alphas under pressure. She broke completely. Next. Hot bonus story 3, The Marking Game Under the Stars. Cassiel's estate garden was quiet and soft. Night wind rustled the lavender. The air smelled faintly sweet. A swing hung between two old trees. Wide, wooden, and padded with a thick wool blanket. Overhead, stars shimmered, and the only sounds were bugs and breeze. Lyra wore a mint-green silk nightgown, legs swinging slowly. Her cheeks were pink from a hot bath. She leaned back, relaxed, looking up at the moon. Cassiel stood behind her, one hand on the swings rope, the other on her waist, pushing her gently. Ronan lounged on the blanket beneath, arms folded behind his head, watching her gown flutter with every motion. What game are we playing? Lyra asked, smiling. A simple one, Cassiel whispered. Whoever's kiss makes you stop swinging wins. Before she could laugh, Ronan stood, walked to her knees, and said softly, You get one move. Once you stop, you're ours. The swing slowed. Cassiel's fingers dipped beneath her neckline. Ronan kissed her. Deep. Wet. She tensed, but the swing kept moving. You're really trying, sweetheart, Ronan murmured. Then Cassiel stroked the spot that made her tremble, and the swing stopped. Everything stopped. Before she could react, they lifted her to the blanket. Cassiel's eyes burned. Now it's our turn to push you. Ronan claimed her breast, tongue firm and hot. Her clothes scattered onto the grass. Hair spread over the wool like a halo. She was the prettiest prey the forest had ever seen. Cassiel wrapped around her from behind. We're right here. Ronan licked her ankle. I wonder if you'll scream less when we mark you under the stars. Night deepened. Grass rustled. She cried into Cassiel's chest, Ronan holding her steady. The swing swayed in the wind. The stars shone on. They stayed. And she whispered through her tears, I want to fall asleep here. Forever. They didn't answer. They only held her tighter. Next. Hot bonus story 4, ripe with time. Lyra was 6 months pregnant. Her body bloomed, full, warm, and unbearably sensitive. That night, she rolled over in bed, pressing against the tightness in her chest. Too full, she muttered, frowning. The door creaked open. Cassiel entered, saw her face, and moved immediately. He sat beside her, hands gentle as they cupped her swollen breasts. Why didn't you wake me? I didn't want to bother you, she murmured, cheeks flushed. Cassiel kissed her collarbone. Not waking us is the real crime. He carefully pulled off her nightgown, leaving only the soft camisole. His hands covered her again, heat soothing the ache. Lyra gasped, fingers gripping the sheets. Then Ronan entered, hair messy, eyes sleepy but sharpening fast. Is she leaking again? Cassiel nodded. Worse this time. Ronan joined them, holding her hand, whispering by her ear, "What should we do, little mama?" She panted, voice shaking, "Be gentle." Cassiel took one side into his mouth, coaxing the tension with his tongue. Ronan pulled her into his arms, palm resting on her belly, feeling the gentle kicks inside. "You've been so strong," he murmured. "We should have helped you sooner." Lyra's face burned. Her body trembled, thighs clenching. "I just feel ugly," she choked. Cassiel looked up, eyes fierce and soft. "You're divine." Ronan kissed her forehead. "You're the Luna carrying our future." "We're honored." They didn't have sex. Just mouths. Hands. Warmth. After she lay between them, tear-streaked but calm. "Thank you for not being disgusted," she whispered. Ronan wiped her cheeks. "You just focus on growing more milk." Cassiel pulled her close, whispering against her ear, "When the baby's out, we'll drink every drop." Slowly. She smiled, soft and drowsy. Inside, the night was still. Inside, the love overflowed. "All right. Tell me in the comments what kind of spicy werewolf content you want next. More mates or forbidden love story? I read every comment, and I might just write your idea into the next bonus episode. If you like this video, please subscribe my channel. Your support keeps me writing and keeps the heat coming. See you in the next episode.